a brief holiday. We're back with the very wise and knowledgeable Agent Smith. What's up, dude?
Hello.
Rockin' and rollin'. We're several hours into today's stream. And in the US, we had a extra spicy, terrible event that happened very recently. What was it, Charlottesville? Something like that?
Yeah, Charlottesville, Virginia.
I'd been always kind of seeing those things in EU, and it's very far from us. But then having an event happen like that on American soil, it's rather concerning. And I've had a lot of Europeans very surprised at the amount of Nazism that's in the United States, which, if you're thinking about the context of World War II and the US being a major player in the war against Nazi Germany, it's a little bit almost contradictory. But we have a lot of that sentiment kind of brewing. One of the major overtones right now for us, culturally and politically speaking. So, what's been going on?
Sorry, it's hard to hear you.
Is it my mic is messed up? Or something on your
I
end?
think it's my connection. It's been a little wonky the past day or two.
Well, it sounds really good on your end. So maybe you're able to send sound but not receive. But basically you can just kick it off with whatever you feel like has been especially pertinent in the past few weeks while we've been away. What did we miss for those who get our news from you?
It's a bunch of stuff. I don't know. What do you feel like? Any particular part of the world or topic?
What has been happening? Well, let's kind of pick up where we left off last week with Qatar, Saudi Arabia. Any new developments on that front?
Not really. I haven't noticed anything big. Had said that they were going to kind of shift gears away from the original 13 demands, and they reissued like 6 new demands, and that those 6 new demands mostly focused on counter-terror strict. But then, like a week later, they started talking about the original 13 demands, which included the more extreme demands like getting rid of Al Jazeera and that kind of thing. So apparently those are not off the table after all. So that continues to be at a kind of impasse, and it's not really clear what the end game will be, or really what even the objectives the Saudis are pursuing are, because they seem to kind of change their tone from week to week. But other than that, no, not really any new major developments there. They're still kind of just in facing off.
Was there something different that happened with North Korea? Because the dialogue with that has been pushed forward a lot, and Trump has been tweeting and saying words.
Yeah, what happened was they tested and what happened was they tested on ICBM, clearly missile than that they had done previously. And that kind of escalated tensions a bit. It's an aggressive move on their part. It very much flouted the pressure that's been brought on them to tone down the missile program and their nuclear program. So that sped things up in terms of international cooperation on bringing sanctions and whatnot. What's kind of new is the variable that Donald Trump introduces, because he's kind of unpredictable, and that introduces an extra layer of uncertainty to the crisis that wasn't really there before, and that has people more worried than they would be generally. I think overall it's still very unlikely there will be a war or anything like that. The North Korean government is very self-interested. They're not going to do anything that would threaten their continued existence, threaten their continued rule. So most likely they'll just continue posturing aggressively anything. The Trump administration, as unpredictable and unstable as Donald Trump may be, is going to do anything too aggressive either, because I don't think there's a lot they can accomplish that wouldn't be immensely disruptive to the, if not the international, as immensely destructive generally. So most likely status quo will continue, just with more posturing.
Mhm. Well, one of the things you talked about in the little piece that you wrote around Trump's election was he's the kind of strongman leader where he likes to talk a lot and sort of threaten and make the most use of the potential for him to be aggressive around the world without actually doing too much, which is kind of what the North Korean establishment is like as well, because they're all about talking and threatening and telling people that they've got the latest and the greatest missile and they're not afraid to use it type of thing, but nothing ever really happens with that either.
Yeah, it's all game theory with the North Koreans. They're not, they're not going to make any bold moves that are going to upset the equilibrium they've got.
I would guess that based on what you've told me about Shinzo Abe, that Japan is going to have a little bit of a heyday in terms of using that type of stuff to move forward their nationalistic efforts and military and that sort of thing.
Sorry, what? That got garbled.
Shinzo Abe's relationship to this. So if North Korea's talking a whole bunch and then Trump is talking, that gives them some justification for moving their agenda forward.
Yeah, that definitely plays into his narrative, which is that Japan needs to rearm and have a more, well, at least sufficient military capacity to do something on their own if they needed. Certainly more flexibility to deal with something like North Korea without having to consult with the United States or other countries first. That said, it's not actually, the opportunity might not be taken advantage of, because the Abe administration has actually become embroiled in a series of corruption scandals related. What I think one of them was a preschool or a kindergarten or something that this far-right nationalist guy set up, supposedly with basically he bought a bunch of government-owned land that was suspiciously cheap. And the suspicion is that maybe the government or somebody in government sold it to him below market price. Were sympathetic to far-right views. So that became a thing. And then there was another issue about Japanese peacekeepers in the Sudan. Apparently, there was supposedly a cover-up regarding how dangerous the situation in Sudan was becoming. Basically, if Japanese peacekeepers in Sudan were facing a degree of violence in the Sudan threshold, then it was they might have to be recalled, because part of the condition of them being there is that they keep the peace, but they're not really active combatants. And if the security situation in the Sudan, this is South Sudan specifically, I think, deteriorated significantly, then that would be ground for removal. And so the controversy was that supposedly there was a cover-up about the security situation in the Sudan. Supposedly there's a report made that kind of informs the Japanese government about the security situation, but that was somehow lost or removed. And it's not really clear who, and there's a big investigation going on, circumstances. And I think that was the controversy that led to the defense minister. About her, the defense minister in Japan is a woman who we talked about a couple weeks ago, whom people in the West were excited about because she was a woman, and there aren't a lot of women in Japanese politics. So it was kind of for a progressive move for Shinzo Abe to appoint her, but then kind of lost in that was the fact that she was kind of on the far right on the political spectrum, and so kind of had been forced to step down as a result of this controversy. And all told, there's more and more pressure being brought to bear on the Shinzo Abe administration in general on account of these scandals, and it's making it harder for him, harder than it already was, to propagate his sort of right-wing agenda with regard to Japan. Japan's military and reforms there, and to a lesser degree, economic reforms.
So a bit of a cluster.
So
for
maybe
Japan.
he'll be able to take advantage of it, but probably not. He's got other things go acting.
Yeah, they need to time their corruption scandals a little bit better.
I thought it was in. Yeah. Well, I think most politicians would agree with that sentiment with regard to most political scandals. One thing on North Korea I thought was really interesting was that something that happened in China. This newspaper, the Global Times, which is sort of this right-wing, well, it's a very nationalist publication in the Chinese media landscape. And in China's media, it's kind of hard to print anything too critical of the government because the government, or more accurately, the party, will actually, it has specific guidelines about what can be published in the media, and also has guidelines regarding how people working in media should sort of self-censor. So generally, if something gets published in the Chinese media, it's kind of tacitly assumed that it does so with the approval, at least nominal approval, of the Communist Party. And the reason that's significant is because the Global Times published an article a couple days ago in which I think it was an editorial where the author suggested that if North Korea started a war, like if the war started on the Korean Peninsula and it was specifically because of something North Korea did, that China should not support them, that China should not come to their aid. And the support of China is a major deterrent for North Korea, because even with nuclear weapons, hypothetically a war could break out, but if North Korea could count on Chinese military support, that acts as a major additional deterrent for aggressive military action against North Korea. But that author in that article suggested that maybe that deterrent isn't there, at least if the North Koreans do something. And so that in itself is, well, for one, it's a powerful deterrent for the North Koreans to do anything aggressive, since it means that they couldn't count on that backup, which they would need in the event of a conflict with the United States. Even with however many atomic weapons they have, they probably would not be able to win a war with the United States. But more to the point, it's in so much as it represents the Chinese government's view, it really shows that the Chinese government is also interested in stopping the North Korean nuclear program, or at the very least tempering tensions, such as they are. So I thought that was an interesting signal on the part of the Chinese government. It shows that they're very much, maybe not necessarily siding with the Trump administration specifically, but at the very least they're on the same page as far as coordinating to try to tamper down on the North Korean nuclear program.
I think Pac had to update her Discord, but she should be back pretty soon here. I don't know if there are any questions in the queue.
There's some update?
I believe so. I think your sound has mostly evened out. There have been a few times where it cuts, but it's been mostly good.
Okay. Well, there's other important stuff to talk about, but there were two interesting random stories out of Russia that I thought were just weird, I guess. There was a surface-to-air missile stolen in Russia, and it ended up in a scrapyard. It was an SA-5 missile, and apparently, while they were trying, whoever it was at the scrapyard that had it, they were trying to dismantle it, and somehow they did something that made it explode.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, so don't steal surface-to-air missiles. Lesson learned.
Okay.
Because you're probably not going to be able to manage them correctly. So, yeah, the authorities, long story short, the authorities found the stolen surface-to-air missile when it exploded in a scrapyard.
Was it the explosion that gave it away?
Yeah, that was a pretty big giveaway. It was very noticeable.
Damn, our cover is blown, and so is our surface-to-air missile.
Yeah, two people were killed, so it may be that there's not any witnesses left to really investigate the circumstances of the actual theft of the missile, because obviously, probably somebody involved in the military was involved in that, you would think.
Hmm.
But they may be in the clear, and maybe that their accomplices got pretty thoroughly blown up.
That's
So that,
embarrassing.
yeah, yeah, that's embarrassing for all parties involved, really.
What would the benefit be? It seems like, what are you going to shoot in the air with that missile?
Yeah, see, that's the thing. That's what I want to know. Because it's a scrapyard, so presumably they want to sell it for scrap, but what's in a missile that you couldn't get with something that you could acquire with much less risk?
Yeah.
It seems like a surface-to-air missile is like a weirdly specific thing to want for scrap. So
Mhm.
I don't know enough about missile technology to know what the game plan there was. I don't think they thought it through entirely, though. Might want to invest in the learning how to handle explosives before doing something like that. And obviously, they did not do that. So the other story out of Russia that I thought was interesting was had to do with a guy who ended up basically being what would the word be? Well, he was arrested and he had to go to trial because he was accused of threatening this former special forces guy in some business deal with a gun. He threatened him with a gun. And a lot of people became very skeptical of this when it was discovered that the guy being on trial had muscular dystrophy. Right. So this is a guy in a wheelchair who can barely move, and this ex-special forces guy apparently felt sufficiently threatened that he called the police on him.
Hmm.
And so the suspicion is that this guy, whoever this ex-special forces guy, is just lying his ass off and is basically just trying to get rid of a guy who he doesn't want to pay money to, or is part of some other arrangement or business deal that fell through.
Mhm. Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about muscular dystrophy, but it seems like it would be quite hard to accurately aim a weapon at someone
Yeah,
if you're
yeah.
wheelchair bound.
So some people in Russia were kind of upset about what that case said about Russia's justice system and general rule of law.
Mhm. How's Venezuela doing? Still shitty as ever?
Yeah, it's been downhill because they had the election for the Constitutional Assembly that the government wants to rewrite the Constitution. I don't think they're actually that interested in rewriting the Constitution, though. Subsequent events since the Constitutional Assembly election was held and the Assembly has, well, assembled, basically. It's there now. It really looks like the government wants to use it as a substitute legislature. They're trying to use it, I think, to circumscribe the National Assembly, the proper legislature in Venezuela, which is controlled by the opposition.
Hmm.
And that's especially useful for the government since the opposition boycotted the vote for the Constitutional Assembly, which means that the Constitutional Assembly is basically entirely pro-government. So the way it works basically is the proper legislature, the National Assembly, will try to do something. The Supreme Court will shoot it down. And then meanwhile, the Constitutional Assembly will basically pass mandates or what have you in the legislature's stead. Yeah, I had not realized that the Constitutional Assembly actually had that kind of power, but apparently it does. There's this Attorney General in Venezuela, like the national level Attorney General, and she became very critical of the Maduro government as it became more basically authoritarian, or it kind of trended in that direction. And she had been a Chavista, she had been a part of their party, but as she turned on them, there became more and more tension. But they never removed her, and I don't really know why. But the Constitutional Assembly itself has voted to remove her, and so she's been replaced based on their authority. And again, I was not aware that a constitutional assembly had that authority. That seems to go rather beyond the ambit of just negotiating a new constitution. But after they voted on it, Venezuelan police surrounded her office and prevented her from entering. And so effectively, she's been removed, according to the action of that assembly. So that seems to be the government strategy going forward. They're going to just use that assembly as the new legislature. Doesn't really say much for the... it's not a very good counter-argument to accusations of authoritarianism, basically.
Yeah.
It more kind of plays into that. Other than that, though, there hasn't been a lot of movement. The government hasn't made clear what its plans are, basically. They have the Constitutional Assembly in place, but I haven't read anything that kind of suggests what direction they're going to go in. Stuff outside Venezuela, with regard to Venezuela, Mercosur, which is sort of like this South American economic organization that ties together these different countries' economies, where different countries come together to negotiate, basically, tariffs and things like that. Mercosur suspended Venezuela's membership. So that kind of suggests that there is some regional solidarity in terms of opposing, the direction that the Maduro government is going. That could be a good sign for the future in terms of bringing to bear international pressure if things do continue to go downhill. The other big thing was Trump threatened sanctions, and those sanctions were eventually passed. They targeted specific individuals in the Venezuelan government. I don't know that anybody in Venezuela much cares about that, since everybody in Venezuela is pretty suspicious of the United States, if not everybody in Latin America generally. The United States doesn't have a great reputation down there, so I don't know that it matters that much who we sanction. But it's there. It was a kind of a symbolic action we took. Rather less helpful was the Trump administration threatening to use military force. I didn't think that was very helpful at all, because sanctions are kind of acceptable on the part of Latin America, but if there's one thing everybody in Latin America hates, it's the idea of the United States using military force to exert pressure on a government or change a government. That there's a lot of historical precedent for that that's not very positively received in Latin America. So I think it would kind of serve American interests if Trump would kind of tone that down a bit and focus more on building a regional coalition to bring pressure to bear on Venezuela.
Yeah.
American unilateralism on that issue is not going to have a lot of traction with anybody. And there's not a whole lot of pressure the United States can bring to bear anyway. It would be much more useful to get Colombia, say, or some other neighboring country to kind of bring pressure to bear, because that's going to be more substantive in terms of impact. Yeah, there was something that I had this in my notes from way back before the break. The Venezuelan legislature had tried to appoint something like 33 judges to the Venezuela's Supreme Court. Something to that effect. But the administration said that they wouldn't allow any judges to be removed, and I don't think that ended up happening. I think the and scuppered that attempt by the Venezuelan legislature to exert some power and try to take back the judicial branch, so to speak. So that was that's an example of how the legislature has been stymied by the executive branch in Venezuela. Yeah, more broadly, this is all a really good example of the importance of democratic norms to the working of a democratic political system. You can make as many rules as you want to try to ensure that people in a democratic government don't abuse their power, and to ensure that certain norms are observed. But fundamentally, if people don't want a democracy or don't want to observe the norms of a democracy, then you kind of just can't have one.
Yeah.
Right? Because the big problem in Venezuela is that a big chunk of the voting electorate, specifically the Chavistas, they're interested more in class warfare than they are in reaching an agreement with the opposition. And, their argument, to be fair, the Chavista counter-argument is that they're fighting against, right-wing oppressors who are trying to maintain their privilege, their undeserved, unfair privilege in Venezuela's very unequal society. And of course, there are all the, accusations of economic warfare on the part of economic elites who are, so supposedly are purposely emptying the stores, emptying the, various retail establishments of goods purposely in order to put pressure on the Venezuelan people to turn on the Chavista government. I don't think that's very likely. I think it's much more likely the lack of goods has to do with the collapse in the value of the currency, as well as price controls. But there may be something to that to a degree. It's not as though Venezuela's economic elites don't have a history of using their power to try to maintain their position in society. So, once there's the point I'm making is that once there's a breakdown in trust between the major political groups in a country, it becomes virtually impossible to continue governance as usual, to have a stable government. And if people don't recognize those norms, that the opposition does have a place and that you should not do everything in your power to sideline an opposition, or, to turn on the other side of the coin, an opposition should not do everything in its power to try to stymie a government. Once you get to that point, it's just impossible to do anything. And you just end up inevitably trending towards some degree of authoritarianism. So Venezuela, in that regard, is a cautionary tale for other societies that have struggling democratic systems where partisanship is kind of eroding democratic norms. Here in the United States, it's kind of a norm that, you get assigned positions as a senator or a representative. You get assigned positions in Congress according to your expertise, to your position, and to your seniority. And also, there's the filibuster, where you can basically stop a vote from happening by talking continuously. All of that is a kind of norm. There's nothing written in the U.S. Constitution or in law that things have to be done that way. That's all just done as tradition, basically. And if people really wanted to kind of to really upset the system, to really make it impossible to do anything, all you would have to do is change that. It's become more and more difficult, for example, to vote in nominations by the president to the judicial system, specifically to the Supreme Court. And it got to the point where they changed the rules so that a simple majority was enough to pass a nomination, whereas before it required a larger majority, which made it, requiring a larger majority to pass a nominee to the Supreme Court made it such that you generally had to have a compromise candidate. But because, political opposition, and this is bipartisan, by the way, both parties have done this, because it was becoming increasingly difficult to get the opposition to agree on what would constitute a quote-unquote compromise candidate, the rule basically had to be changed so that somebody could get appointed. So that speaks to the need for recognition of democratic norms and the importance therein to the operation of democracy.
Got a question.
We got a question about the South China Sea, the South Sea bubble from the 1700s. Yeah, I do know what that is, but the only reason I know what that is because somebody way back when we first started doing this recommended a YouTube series to me. It was like a YouTube history series. I don't remember what it was called, but yeah, the set of episodes I watched was actually about the South Sea bubble. If I could, I'll try to remember what it is, and if I do, I'll remember it. But yeah, I think that guy even came back later and asked what I thought about the series. I liked it. I thought it was a good YouTube channel. South Sea Bubble. So basically, after the what was it? I want to say the War of Spanish Succession. This is really early 1700s. The British government had a shit ton of debt, and it needed a way to pay it beyond just hiking taxes, because it was having trouble generating the revenue. And so I'm probably not remembering this exactly right, so the details might be a little iffy. But basically, the government kind of teamed up with this guy who was sort of a financier, an entrepreneur, if you will. And the agreement was that the government would help him fund a company that would basically be one of these, like the East India Company, basically a trading company. And this trading company would have a monopoly that the government actually did write up and give them, a monopoly on trade in the South China Sea. I think it was the South China Sea. And so in exchange for that, basically the company would help pay the government's debt. And the way they would do that is that people who owned government debt could exchange that debt for shares in the company. And so in that way, the government could alleviate the pressure, because the government obviously was a big stakeholder. And so whenever people traded in their their debt, their bonds, basically government bonds, for shares in the company, that debt was basically erased, because the bonds just went right back to the government. So this was a really clever way of, basically alleviating, if not getting rid of the debt. And basically, the company never made any money, but everybody was really excited about it because it had a monopoly on trade in the Far East, and all these other Far East trading companies made so much money. It was just assumed on faith that it would make a lot of money. And so it turned into a Ponzi scheme. People would invest in it, the shares would go up, and then more people would invest in it, and then the share would go up even further. And so it just seemed like the share would go up forever, and more people came into it. And kind of long story short, that guy who sort of ran the company on behalf of the government, he would do little tricks to try to keep the price going up, but nothing was ever actually done to trade in the South Sea, and the company never actually made any money. And it had turned into a huge financial bubble that eventually exploded and just impoverished a whole shit ton of people.
Well,
Government did all right. The government made out like a bandit because it ended up, eating up all of this government debt that they didn't know how to pay back.
so did the government do the responsible thing and put itself in jail?
No such luck.
There was a graphic recently that was comparing the amount of jail time you get per dollar stolen through a Ponzi scheme as opposed to a burglary. It's better to be doing the Ponzi scheme. You get less jail time for the amount that you steal.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. Yeah, when it comes to white-collar crime, to a degree, you can kind of say buyer beware. And I think on account of that, they tend to get off a little easier because there's more culpability on the part of the victims. Unlike, say, with a blue-collar crime, where it's more kind of the fault of the person committing the crime. There's less liability, so to speak, assumed on the part of the victims.
Yeah, and I think with the Ponzi scheme, there's also the defense of, I didn't know that this was going to be really bad for them.
Yeah.
I thought this was actually a good business, right? Wink, wink. Sure.
So somebody asked, what is your take on the Canadian housing market? I don't have too much of a take on it. I don't know a whole lot about it. What I do know is that I know about Vancouver's housing market is taking off. Mostly because of Chinese investment, I think, and that's turned into a big political issue there, since it's making it prohibitively expensive for the common people, basically, to have a place to live. And so there's a growing push to try to limit investment, or at the very least foreign investment, into the housing sector, in order to kind of alleviate the pressure on prices and on renters and buyers. I'm not as sure about the rest of the Canadian economy, so I couldn't really tell you much there. Yeah, that's not a great answer, but yeah, that's what I've got.
There was a documentary on that. It was probably about a year ago that it was made. Just the super wealthy Chinese coming over and just living like kings and stuff, and really messing up the market, because there was a TV show about it, I think, and that really increased the popularity of Chinese who are very wealthy going over and doing that. It was like a reality TV show about their lives and just what they spent their time doing.
Yeah. Yeah, there's also a lot of Chinese are trying to get their money out of China, have been for a couple of years. I think we talked about that even the last time. That people, well, for one, it's hard to find a good investment in China, but also there's a lot more political risk, and so if you have a lot of money, you don't want your money in China where something politically could happen to you. So an attractive spot is Vancouver, partly because there's a lot of Chinese already there. So if you're going to have to leave China at some point, Vancouver's a pretty nice place to go because there's already a number of Chinese there. A lot of them came over after the Hong Kong handover. A lot of people in Hong Kong weren't comfortable with the idea of living in China, so they left with their money and settled in Vancouver. And so that created a kind of gateway community for all these other Chinese from the mainland now to kind of come over. Yeah, I don't think the financial sector in Canada is so deregulated that a lot of people are really investing in housing beyond the foreign investors. So if housing is more expensive in Canada writ large, not just Vancouver, I would imagine it would be because the economy is doing relatively well, which is a good thing. That's a good problem to have. That's a kind of a corollary to good inflation versus bad inflation. You know, bad inflation is just when the costs of things go up over time, like inputs specifically, like oil, or maybe a regulation gets passed that just makes producing more expensive. That's cost push inflation. But on the other hand, if you have demand inflation, if people are just making more money and are more productive and are demanding more things, and that creates inflation, that's a good kind of inflation because that stems from economic growth. So when a central bank or the Federal Reserve or somebody talks about wanting to generate inflation, that's the kind of inflation they're talking about. It's not inflation for the sake of inflation. It's inflation caused by economic growth. Somebody asked, how is the Venezuelan political situation affecting the rest of South America on the geopolitical economic scale? Has that spilled over to Brazil? I don't think the Venezuelan situation is affecting the rest of South America economically very much, or really even geopolitically, because Venezuela sells most of its oil to places like America, or, well, it used to sell to America. Now it sells more to China and Europe. So, and the Venezuelan economy was not like a big generator of demand for goods made in other South American countries. Now that the Venezuelan currency isn't worth anything. So I don't think it's impacting anybody economically that much outside of Venezuela. Geopolitically, you know, Brazil is kind of a southern cone country. I mean, Brazil obviously encompasses a huge chunk of South America, but the bulk of the population and the economic activity in Brazil is more in the southern part of Brazil, kind of around where Uruguay and Argentina are. So it's kind of far away, in a sense, from Venezuela. So in that sense, it's not affected that much at all, really. In so much as the Venezuelan situation affects other countries, I think it's mostly through migrants. People who are leaving Venezuela because they need money or because they want to buy things like toilet paper or medicine, you know, things like that that aren't really greatly available in Venezuela. So there is kind of a, I guess you would almost call it a refugee problem, where you have all these people traveling to other countries for work and money, and maybe seeking political amnesty. I haven't heard about that so much, though. And that creates pressure on communities where those people travel to, since In a lot of cases, those communities are not capable of absorbing such a large influx in population over such a short time. But that's mostly affecting countries immediately next to Venezuela, specifically Colombia. I don't think a lot of them are going to Brazil, like northern Brazil, or to Guyana, because I don't think there's as many opportunities there, really. Most of the migrants leaving Venezuela are going to Colombia, I think. Some to other countries, but mostly Colombia. So the impact is felt mostly there. But I don't think Venezuela has a large enough population to generate a huge number of migrants such that it would really be a big problem for like Brazil or Argentina or Peru or anywhere else where they might go. So I don't think it's going to be that impactful internationally. I wouldn't worry about it in that sense. What's my opinion on countries like France, Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, etc., voting quote-unquote more right recently? More right-wing, he means. We've talked about that before. It's just, it's emblematic of the shift, the underlying shift in the structure of the economies in the developed world, if not the developing world as well. And that transition is generating so much political friction that it's manifesting in that way, that people are turning on moderate political parties, especially center-left political parties, which kind of discredited themselves by trying to propagate a social democratic model of economic management that isn't really sustainable to the same degree it has been before. You can still have one, but if your economy starts to enter into a downturn, then you kind of have to pare it down. And right now, there's so much political resistance to that the center-left wants in that system of welfare benefits, but doesn't have like a good way of paying for it. It has yet to find a good way to do that that's actually viable. And until it does, they're just sort of lying out their ass basically when they say that they're going to maintain that system. And as that sort of paradox continues, they've lost voters. And so the voters have centered more to the right wing as a result. And I think a bigger problem, though, is more the social issue, the social pressure brought to bear by the influx of migrants into Europe. I think before Germany, it was basically Germany. Angela Merkel opened its borders, so to speak, to the Syrian migrants specifically, if not migrants more generally. Before that, it had not been as much of a problem. There was kind of a rightward trend in European politics, but it was kind of within the confines of traditional European politics. But the immigration issue kind of really, really put a lot of pressure on European politics, such that far-right politics became more viable than it had been before. And so that's where the influx, that's where the issue really is. So until the immigration issue kind of gets settled in a way that's kind of satisfactory to social conservatives in Europe, I think there will probably be a question as to the future of European liberalism. Once that gets solved, I think things will kind of fall back into line in terms of normal discourse and normal politics. But for now, that's still an open question as to the direction that'll go. What are your thoughts on the mutual unrest in the current two-party system? I've heard fringes of a class action being filed against the DNC, and the current unfaithfulness the Republicans are showing to the president. Is there a possibility we could trail away from the two-party system? Probably not, because the American political system is not like a parliamentary system where there's proportional voting, and so just by dint of that, the American political system lends itself to a two-party system. Just a small number of parties basically are viable. The trade-off is that on the one hand, yes, we only have the two political parties, but it's also really easy to get into those parties. Like, there's not a big barrier to entry if you want to run as a Democrat or a Republican. And, Trump himself is indicative of that, because Trump himself is not like a classical Republican, a fact which, is a source of great consternation to most long-time Republicans. But even though he wasn't like an establishment, standard Republican, he was still able to run as a Republican and run as the Republican nomination. And to the openness of the party system in, other countries have more political parties, but it's kind of harder to get into them. It's harder to participate in their workings, whereas in the United States, it's wide open, and, that's good and bad. That has its upside and its downside. But, the good thing is that it makes the political parties much more sensitive to the demands of the public than they would be otherwise. And it also lends to coalition building. The political parties are sensitive to different constituencies and will try to pick out constituencies that thinks are, amiable to each other and amiable to the construction of a broader winning political coalition. So it does, it has its issues, but for the most part, it's proven pretty so much as it's open to people. I was just reading the Republican Party facing difficulty because there are so many insurgent candidates running in Republican primaries. That's a problem going forward, is that there are a lot of Republicans right now in Congress who do not particularly like the Trump administration, if not Donald Trump himself. And so there is a sort of rising tide of new insurgent candidates running in primaries that are explicitly pro-Trump and whom are not as establishment Republicans. And so that, on the one hand, if you don't like Trump, that's not really a great trend, but I think it is a good thing in that it allows, a valve for that pressure to be released. It allows those people to participate in the system and to have a voice. So I don't think we're going to trail away from the two-party system. I think it is still functioning. I think more the problem is that the parties are right now in a place where they don't have a lot of legitimacy. They've kind of been discredited by the actions of past administrations. And more to the point, we're sort of at a position now where politics in general are kind of discredited. Because this goes back to what I was talking about in Europe. Those same forces that are roiling politics in Europe are also affecting the United States. So there's a transition from a certain economic equilibrium where the economy works a certain way to a new equilibrium. And a lot of people are getting left behind in that process. And there's no easy solution to that, especially in the United States where people are very inimical to the idea of government action, government assistance. And so the result is that political parties have not really done anything to help people through this process of change, through this kind of epochal shift that the world really is going through. And so, but the political parties don't frame it that way. The political parties just do the same thing they've always done, which is to promise this, that, and the other to their constituencies. And then, of course, they fail to deliver on those things, and things don't change, and people then turn on the political parties. What's needed is not so much new political parties. It's to have the parties that are already there, the Republicans and the Democrats, connect with the voters again, to have a winning message, to be able to communicate them, and at the very least be honest that there's not much they can do to help people within the current zeitgeist of American politics anyway. With the changes that are sort of undermining the economic viability of a lot of communities in the United States. So those are my thoughts on it anyway. What is your opinion on the downturn in the oil and gas industry the past few years? Is that a big part of our struggling economy nationally or more regionally in the Gulf Coast area? I don't think it's a big problem nationally because not every part of the American economy depends on oil, right? Texas, for example, is an oil-producing state, so our economy kind of struggles a little bit when oil prices are down. but other parts of the U.S. economy are sort of oil importers. They benefit greatly from cheap oil. So in that sense, it's actually kind of a boost. The United States is such a large economy, that is such a large country, rather, that different parts of the country will benefit at the same time that other parts are struggling. There's kind of an inverse relationship there in some ways. So I don't think it's a national problem. And yeah, like you say, I think it is more of a regional Gulf Coast problem.
We talked a couple episodes ago about the Texas economy, and one of the crashes in history that caused Texas to choose to diversify its economy a little bit beyond just being an oil-based one.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons the Texas economy is still doing so good, even though oil prices are so depressed. The Texas economy has diversified successfully into technology and manufacturing and whatever else there is here, such that the Texas economy is now still a leading state in terms of economic growth, even though such a big part of its economy, the oil industry, is struggling with low prices. So that's a kind of a testament to that sort of liberal economic ethos that exists here, liberal in the classical sense. We've talked about that before too.
Yep.
Yeah, the U.S. economy writ large is not struggling because the gas industry isn't doing well, because gas and oil prices are low. Really, the U.S. isn't struggling at all. Technically, it's actually doing very well. It's been adding jobs pretty consistently for, almost 10 years. That hasn't been adding jobs extensively. The rate of job growth has not been awesome, but it's been consistent and it's been overall good. I think the problem is not so much that the economy is not performing. The problem is that employment is not where people want it to be. Employment for people, I think, between ages 18 and 30 is not as high as people want it, specifically for people who do not have college education, for people with for high school graduates. Unemployment is still unusually high. And for those people, the economy looks like it's doing very badly because there are opportunities. But, for companies, for the manufacturing people who have college degrees, the economy has actually been doing pretty well. I think the fact that there are so many people who say that the economy is doing badly, and then also, the simultaneous existence of so many people who say it's doing well, speaks to the level of inequality in the United States. There's a lot of inequality in terms of opportunities and in terms of education, in terms of, jobs. I mean, there's so much inequality that the economy looks dramatically different depending on your perspective. Objectively, it's doing fine, but for certain groups, not so much. And so, because the oil and gas industry has traditionally been an avenue of employment for people with high school education, I think the fact that it's struggling impacts them especially. So that's my opinion anyway, and make of that what you will. Somebody wrote, I'm interested in paying attention to world events. Can you offer some sources you find reputable? I'm never sure what news sources to trust. Yeah, so it's not a matter of trusting. You should always be skeptical. There's no quick and easy way to really just be informed. I mean, the best way is to just be constantly learning. Not really about current events per se. Learn economics, political science, learn technical, professional skills, all of those things. Try to learn something about, so that you can more objectively critique what you're reading. That's the best way to kind of read news. There's no one magic source of news that will inform you upon reading it, that you will consume and leave you as the informed person. You just have to be constantly critical and constantly learning and improving your ability to critique and analyze what you read. So that said, if you want sources, well, for one, I'll say something that I said the first time we talked about this, because we've talked about this a little bit before. No news source is objective. All of them have biases. The trick is not to avoid sources that have no bias. The trick is to understand the bias of what you're reading. some papers are better about that than others. Some papers recognize that and try to be clear about it. Others try to pretend that they're giving you the gospel truth, even though they're heavily subjective. In general, I would recommend BBC World News just for scope. BBC World News does a good job generally of covering just the breadth of world news, so you'll generally get a good impression of everything that's going on if you pay attention to that, bias aside. If you want something deeper, I've always liked the Christian Science Monitor. I think they do pretty good, to a degree, investigative stuff, but generally they try to be relatively impartial. Real Clear World is a good aggregate news site. They generally do a pretty good job just aggregating a whole shit ton of different sources. That could be a good start if you're looking to just get into issues. The Diplomat is a really good source for Asia-Pacific news. They generally focus more on economics and national security issues, but they have a pretty broad ambit. They cover lots of different countries in Asia, and they get a lot of contributors who have backgrounds in like political science and economics. So their analytical stuff is generally pretty good. So definitely would recommend the Diplomat. Yeah, those are generally the ones I hit most frequently. But there's generally not something I won't read. You know, if I see something that looks interesting, I'll grab it and then look into it further if I'm suspicious. Yeah, that's the short list. Really, you just kind of have to build your own list of news sources over time. Like I've got a big Excel sheet that just has a shit ton of them, and if I'm interested in a particular topic, then I'll pick out something that I think would be, I pick out a news source that I think would be more likely to talk about that, especially in more depth. So, you know, kind of build your set of news sources that you hit regularly, and then maybe find some that you can hit more irregularly for more specific topics. You can also look into think tanks, which generally give the best analytical information, analytical side if you're looking for that. And for that, you know, you just have to find the ones that that you like, that you're comfortable with. Some are very biased, some try to be impartial, and some of that is subjective, determining what's impartial and what's not. And that's a tricky game, and I won't get into that. But yeah, I would definitely recommend trying to find some think tanks, and for very specific topics anyway, to try to learn about them. So then the next question was, if you were in Japan here, what is your take on political leadership in Japan with the Abe administration? Lots of us are troubled about the constitutional changes to the military system. Yeah, we've hit on this before. But we hit on this, I think, in what, week 3 or 4,
Yeah.
about the Abe administration. Yeah, people outside of Japan just are not that familiar with the Abe administration. It just seems like another Japanese government. And I think that kind of is a result of the fact that Japanese political culture is very subdued in terms of presentation. Like, you know, whatever you believe in, you always have to present yourself very calmly, and you do things by consensus according to the group, and etc. So very little dramatic happens in Japanese politics that would kind of serve as an alarm bell to attract attention from outside Japan. Like in Taiwan, they have brawls. You know, occasionally they'll just start beating the shit out of each other, and then people outside Taiwan say, oh, hey, what's that about? Maybe we should pay attention to that. There's no real equivalent in Japan, so Japan kind of flies under the radar of international news. So the secret sauce of Shinzo Abe and the Abe administration is that it's one of the most conservative administrations in recent Japanese political history. And it has a very sort of retrograde view about Japan's role in the world, and especially about certain historical issues. You know, we talked a little bit earlier about the Japanese defense minister, a woman. Her name, I don't remember her name. It was Tomoko something. And, you know, her thing is that she had written history about the Nanjing massacre, the rape of Nanking. And she was one of the people that said, you know, it was overblown, that the criticism of the Japanese and the rape of Nanking was overblown, and it didn't happen in the same way people said it happened. Which is, you know, a hugely controversial thing to believe in Asia generally, certainly in China. But for the Abe administration, that was kind of a feature, not a flaw, and so they invited her in. Yeah, Tona Inada. And so just little things like that, you know, very kind of purposely high profile, visiting the that shrine. I don't remember what it's called. It's like a war dead shrine that that venerates Japan's war dead, people who fought for Japan in its various wars, including people who fought in World War II, some of whom were explicitly war criminals. It wouldn't necessarily be a problem that they visited the shrine. It's just that they make such a big deal about it. Like whenever they go, they always have there's always cameras there, and they always try to make a big show of it to try to appeal to the right wing of Japanese politics. And sort of the tone of the visits is more the problem than the visits themselves, I think. So, yeah, also there's these things about revising the Constitution, like you say in your question. Trying to kind of rebuild the Japanese military, or at least have a formal one. Another one of the changes the Abe administration wanted to have is to actually have a proper defense department. Because right now it's technically like just it's a part of the Japanese military, such as it is, the self-defense force, is a part of another department. It's not its own independent war department. And so the Abe administration wanted to change that. They wanted, you know, Shinzo's Abe narrative, his whole narrative about how he wants to change Japan, is that he wants to quote-unquote normalize Japan. He wants Japan to be like a normal country, so like with a normal war department and a normal military that can go do things overseas like a normal country could. And I don't know, see, the suspicion is that his definition of normal, quote-unquote, is doing something stupid. Like, you know, the United States, for example, periodically has adventures overseas, you know, some of which are not particularly well planned. And so there's a suspicion in Japan that maybe he wants to do something like that, or maybe be more involved in America's military operations. And people in Japan are very critical of that. You know, thus far, he hasn't gotten a lot of traction, because most of the reason people in Japan support him is because he promised to reform the economy and reintroduced economic growth, because Japan's economy has been stagnating for like decades now. And people kind of, for the bulk of voters, especially center voters, people in the center, political center, they kind of tolerate the social conservatism in exchange for the economic conservatism. But the lack of progress in the economy and the lack of and the political scandals have kind of tempered that. So it might be that he faces significant political headwinds in the near future that destroys any chance of him kind of delivering on those more social conservative aspects of his administration. Yeah, he's faced a lot of opposition from the left, obviously, but then also from within his own political coalition. There's this one political party that's part of his coalition that's like a Buddhist party. I don't remember what they're called, but they've been kind of cagey about whether or not they support reforms to the military. And they've kind of served as sort of a block to that. They gave some way, and they ended up with a compromise that allowed minimal, basically, reform of the Constitution, or rather, reinterpretation. They didn't actually change the Constitution, and this is actually another thing that the Abe administration is guilty of. Rather than actually having a debate about changing the Constitution and then making the necessary compromises to do that, they just skirted that entire process. They cut the public out, and they just reinterpreted the Constitution. So rather than actually changing it, they've just reinterpreted it in a way that's more amenable to their goals, which is kind of a shitty move. You know, that kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with democratic norms. You know, if you want to live in a democratic society, there are some things you just can't do. You know, you have to respect your opposition, you have to respect the public. And the Abe administration has done a lot of things that are not in keeping with democratic norms. And so reinterpreting a constitution in a way that is a de facto rewriting of the Constitution, that's one way to do that. That is one way to kind of force your views and to get around normal procedures that would normally require you to, you know, negotiate with the opposition and to win over the public, to proselytize amongst the public, to try to make them understand what you're trying to do and build support. And if you can't build that support, then you wouldn't do it. Well, it's not a problem if you just reinterpret it. And so that's a big criticism right there. And that's just in addition to all the little creepy things they do. Like criticizing the media, for example. They tried to pass a rule that would make it so that the media could not kind of contravene the government's line on certain issues. And then there was the law they passed about, and I think we talked about this too, that they passed a law that would make it, I think it was a conspiracy law, where if you were found to have conspired, even if you didn't actually commit the crime, just conspiring to commit the crime would allow you to be arrested and held, if not convicted. And, you know, other countries have conspiracy laws too. That's not the problem in and of itself. The problem is that it's written ambiguously in a way that would allow people to be arrested for basically arbitrarily. You know, if the government didn't like you, then they could maybe investigate you on something, you know, circumstantial or some random thing. Or they could even, by creatively using this law, generate an excuse to tap your phones and observe you, and then maybe then get you on some kind of very abstract reading of conspiracy law. And, you know, Japan's police have like a 99% conviction rating. And that, you know, Japanese police are they have a lot of authority, but it's also very rare for them not to convict, just because people are afraid. You know, when they bring someone in, they're generally afraid to go against the police until they'll actually confess under pressure from the police. So that's the weakness in the weakness in Japan's police forces as an institution, combined with the conspiracy laws. Those two factors together are the source of the discontent. That's where the problem lies, rather than with the conspiracy laws in and of themselves. So that's what was the original question? I kind of went off on a tangent there. What is my take on the political leadership? I mean, basically that's my take, that it's a conservative administration that's trying to sneak in socially conservative changes to Japanese society while trying to use economic reform as a justification, as their sort of bulwark, using that as a shield. But I think they're kind of running out of time on that, and I don't know how much longer that political coalition can last under current constraints. So that's my take on it. Make of that what you will. Who do you consider to have the most misrepresented bias news source that most see as unbiased but has an agenda that might not be clear on the surface? Yeah, that's kind of tough, because in a bipartisan political environment, almost everybody, you can find at least one person who thinks a given media outlet has a clear bias. So I don't know that there are any media outlets left that you could say that people think are unbiased broadly. Obviously, people on the left will think that something is unbiased, that obviously has a leftist bias. People on the right will have their, you know, conservative biased sources that are conservative biased. So, I mean, really, you could make that accusation against any particular group. You could say, go to any group that has that lives in an echo bubble and say, hey, your echo bubble is not partial, is not impartial, it's biased. And they would argue, you know, obviously if you asked them, they would say that it's not biased, or that it's, you know, at least relatively unbiased.
Burn the heretic.
Yeah. So I have trouble thinking of a media source that everybody, or at least that most people would think of as impartial, that is actually not and has a clear specifically bias.
One quick timeout. Yeah. We just got a big host from Pig. So Pig viewers coming in. I'm still playing StarCraft games right now, but we have a politics and world foreign policy expert in Discord with me, and we're just talking about the world, current events. You can ask questions in the chat, and those will be directed to him. So it's more of a dialogue where he is the foreground by voice, and I'm still playing games, so I'm the foreground by the visual action. So welcome, and thanks, Pig, for the host.
Cool.
Continue. Sorry.
No, that's actually about all I had to say about it, because I can't think of any one media outlet that could be considered, that is universally considered unbiased, but that actually clearly is. I don't think such a thing exists anymore.
There have been a few graphics, I'm not sure how accurate they are, where they'll plot out the different news sources and where they fall in the left, right, up, down political axes.
Yeah. Yeah, I found one like that too, but it was actually made as a response to that. And it was made by some, I don't know, alt-right guys or something like that. And it was completely different, obviously. But that just speaks to the point I'm making. Like, different people have different opinions on that. And so having that one universally recognized, unbiased group is just utterly impossible. You know, any exercise to try to peg media sources as to peg the bias of media sources is innately a subjective exercise. It says more about the person doing the grading than it does about the media outlets in question. So, the next thing was, what do you think about the glut of education degrees, education/degrees, and the sort of education inflation cost on the economy increasing the wage/employment gap? Yeah, that's very insightful, because generally when people talk about inflation, they focus on what they call core inflation. You know, economists are most concerned about core inflation, and core inflation refers to things like food, housing, you know, necessities, basically. And the reason economists focused on core inflation amongst that particular set of goods is because that set of goods is more sensitive to demand. You know, we were talking before about good and bad inflation, and good inflation is the inflation that's caused by increases in demand stemming from economic activity, which you want. And so economists want to see inflation in core inflation because they see that as more likely to stem from good, quote-unquote, good inflation. But that's problematic to a degree, because inflation outside of core inflation, outside of that core group, can still have a big impact. And you know, one of the things I want to do, it's on my very long to-do list, is to kind of investigate what impact inflation outside of core inflation has on an economy. So I don't know a whole lot about that. I can't talk a whole lot about that now because that's something I haven't read about yet. But the question here is insightful because it touches on that. You know, how does that contribute? That increase in education costs does contribute to overall inflation in a way that disproportionately impacts poor people. You know, inflation of any kind always impacts poor people more than it does wealthy people. And so that is a big source of inequality in the United States now, that rise in inflation stemming in part from, you know, gigantic increases in the cost of education. So that's a big contributor to inequality and a lack of social mobility and difficulty in people below a certain income level, you know, finding their way, so to speak, and taking advantage of what opportunities they have. I think another impact of as far as the glut of education/degrees, one of the results of that, because there is like a huge increase in the number of people with college degrees, including PhDs and master's degrees, and what that does is create a very competitive environment. So one of the things that's kind of slowly disappearing is the high-paid, well-paid tenure track positions at universities for people who want to be professors and do research, because there's just so much competition, because there's such a glut in the labor market. There's so many people with PhDs out there that it's pushing down the compensation. You know, there's not like a big increase in the number of positions available, but there's a huge increase in the people demanding those positions, and so pay and benefits are falling with time. And that's making it harder to kind of make it, so to speak, as a researcher, as a professor. Which kind of makes me laugh when other people talk about, you know, how entitled and how spoiled professors are at universities. You know, there are some there who kind of slack off and take advantage of their tenure, take advantage of tenure, but for the most part, it's not an easy way to live, especially if you're not like an experienced professor, if you're just starting out. And going forward, it looks like there's going to be a lot fewer people who have tenure. So that's going to be a problem for those people specifically. For society generally, what happens is that it gets harder for people who don't have college educations to get work. Because it's, what do they call it? I think it's called something like credential inflation, where the bare minimum that the bare minimum that employers request for a given job as far as credentials goes up the more educated a populace becomes. So it used to be that you would, put out a, notice that you had a job open. Maybe it doesn't necessarily require a college degree, but if everybody and their mother has a college degree, you might as well just make that a requirement. Because then, that's generally a good sign. It's perceived as a good sign among employers that somebody has a degree. That person is seen as having an edge over someone who doesn't. And they'll generally prefer someone who has a degree over someone who doesn't. When most people did not have a college degree, that wasn't a problem. Because if you have a job that doesn't require a college degree, then you would figure in a society where most people don't have degrees that you're going to end up with somebody who doesn't have one. So you would not make that a requirement that any job applicant have a degree. But now that most people, well, not most people, but now that a lot of people do have degrees, a lot of employers have started making that a basic requirement, and that locks a lot of high school educated people who don't have degrees out of a lot of jobs that they would have otherwise had. And this is a phenomena you can see in a lot of other societies. This is something you see in like oil-producing economies where, a lot of people have money, get basically royalty money from the government, get oil money from the government, and then they'll send their kids to school, and then everybody in the country has college education, but then the economy is not diverse. It's like strictly an oil-producing economy, and there's relatively little entrepreneurship. So there's not a lot of job creators as opposed to job seekers. And the result is that you have a whole shit ton of people in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, well, maybe not so much the UAE, but Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, etc., where you have a lot of people with college educations, but they don't live in an economy where there are a lot of college level jobs. That is to say, jobs that require someone with a college education. And the result is a huge inflation of the public sector, because the government doesn't really want to go to the trouble of trying to create, a thriving private sector, because that's very difficult to do. Much easier to just create a whole shit ton of public positions, jobs in the public sector, to employ those college-educated people that can't find jobs in the private sector. That's how it happens over there. We're not at that level here in the United States, and probably won't get there since, it's in the political culture in the United States is very hostile to the idea of creating public sector jobs in general, let alone as a de facto welfare program for people who are having trouble hacking it in the private sector. So those are some thoughts on that, some thoughts on education. Follow-up Japan question. There are recently, in addition to the conspiracy laws, there are also pretty strict anti-whistleblower laws. Are these stricter or kind of normal compared to other similar governments? I haven't read as much about the whistleblower laws. Yeah, I would have to look at them to answer your question specifically. Whistleblower Japan laws. So I know a little bit about them. I know that the government passed them more or less to crack down on basically dissidents, specifically within the government. But I don't know how strict they are, and I don't know, not knowing how strict they are, I don't know if I can say that they're unreasonable. I couldn't do a comparative analysis, so I can get back to you on that if you want. You can email me. My email is floating around in that document, I think, so feel free to email me, and I'll be happy to get back to you once I read a little more about it. But for now, I can't get too into that. What are the chances that the Kurds have their own country? Yeah, we talked about this, I think, a couple weeks ago, before the break. Very, very low. I think most of the Well, I'm assuming you're asking because they're having an independence referendum soon in the northern part of Iraq, in Kurdish Iraq. Uh, Even if that vote wins, even if most people vote to declare independence, I don't think they actually will. I mean, an independent Kurdistan in northern Iraq, for one, would have to contend with the Iraqi government, which explicitly rejects their right to declare independence and would fight them if they tried. So, right off the bat, they would have a problem with the Iraqi government. Second of all, northern Iraq is completely surrounded by countries that have large Kurdish minorities who would hate to see an independent Kurdish state on their border. Turkey and Iran specifically. So, for all of the differences between Iraq, Iran, and Turkey, all of them would agree that a Turkish independent state is a bad idea and would all probably work together to undermine it from day one. The current situation is acceptable where there's kind of an autonomous Kurdish region in northern Iraq. Everybody's kind of willing to accept that and work with that, but anything more than that, and you're introducing a high likelihood of conflict. And I think the Kurds know that, and I think the only reason they're holding the referendum is to use it as leverage against the Iraqi government to give them concessions. Because there's a long-running dispute in Iraq between the different parts of Iraq and the Iraqi government. You know, the different North Iraq, South Iraq, and Central Iraq all have different ideas about how basically they all have different policy preferences. And I suspect that the Kurds in northern Iraq are just trying to use the referendum to try to boost their position in those ongoing negotiations. I guess the United States could help them out and guarantee their protection, which is basically what would have to happen in order to make an independent Kurdish state viable, but I don't think the United States would want to do that. We talked a little bit about this before. The United States would have to burn a lot of political capital in diplomatic circles in order to do that. Like, it would automatically just make Turkey and Iran and Iraq all rivals of the United States. And I think it's more important for the United States to have good diplomatic relations with all of those countries, which are all very important countries to regional politics, than it is to try to prop up some Kurdish state that would probably not be viable in the long term. Which is why the United States government basically came out and asked the Kurds not to have the referendum and has been basically trying to pressure them into being more moderate about independence. So the next question was, if a uniform guaranteed basic income were implemented, replacing all other forms of welfare, would the free time obtained by people quitting minimum wage jobs lead to improved education, or would it lead to increased drug addiction, social strife, and political violence? Also assume minimum wage laws are entirely repealed. I mean, that depends entirely on the people. You know, some people would see it as a great opportunity to go and educate themselves and improve themselves and, you know, be ambitious and be entrepreneurs, do a lot of things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. But then, you know, some people are shitheads. Some people would abuse the privilege, for sure. And how many people would abuse the privilege versus how many would take advantage of it, you know, I don't know. That would probably vary according to society, according to country, according to region within a society even. You know, it'd probably be it kind of has to be done first in order to see. I don't think you could really predict it beforehand. You know, that would require an experiment where you actually tried it and then observed and then made observations. I couldn't tell you right now like what people would do, you know, if that policy were implemented. We have talked a little bit about UBI before, and you know, I've said before I don't know a lot about it. I still don't. I haven't read like a whole shit ton about it, so I can't really give you like a really great informed opinion about it. But the question here specifically refers to the proportion of people who would take advantage of it versus not taking. And as regard that specific aspect, I don't know, and I don't think anybody can know until it's actually done. I think that's an impossible counterfactual. I think it requires an experiment that involves it actually being done first. Do you think there will be a civil war in Turkey in the next 5 years? That's, there are too many unknown variables there, I think, for anybody to make an accurate prediction on that. Personally, I think it's unlikely, because here's the thing, right? We saw with the last coup attempt last year that Erdogan has enough support that he can mobilize, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people to come onto the streets to protest on his behalf in the face of a coup attempt. And if there were a civil war in Turkey, I imagine it would probably be the result of a coup attempt. But specifically with regard to the previous coup attempt, there was mass mobilization. So any coup attempt has to face that, has to basically plan for that. And I think the reason the last coup attempt was not successful was because it was a very narrowly plotted, plan. It was just it was a small number of people within the military whom did not network properly, as they probably should have, amongst the higher ranking officers in the military to try to organize it. Which is why I kind of really wonder if it really wasn't, like the government says, Gulenists. Because if it had not been Gulenist, I would think that the military would have been more interested in joining the coup. But the fact that the Turkish military did not participate in the coup, by and large, that makes me wonder if it wasn't Gulenist, because the Turkish military does not like Gulenists. It doesn't like Erdogan either, but the Gulenists were the principal tool by which Erdogan was able to kind of strip the military of its traditional power in Turkish politics. So there's a lot of ongoing enmity there between the military and the Gulenists. So if the coup that happened last year was planned by Gulenists, that would explain a lot as far as why the Turkish military didn't participate. That would make a lot more sense to me, anyway. I think if a much better planned coup on the part of the military, especially among higher ranking officers, if that were to happen, I think it would be much more successful than that coup attempt last year. But, and this goes back to the previous point, they would pretty much have to gun down shit tons of pro-Erdogan protesters if they wanted their coup to succeed. Like, Erdogan has proven that there would be mass mobilization of protesters to resist any attempt to seize control of the government. So, as a result, if you're going to have a coup, you basically have to accept beforehand that you're going to kill a shit ton of innocent people. And I don't know how excited people in the military are at that prospect. I think they would rather not, even if they are just raging anti-Erdogan people. And I imagine there has to be at least a few ultranationalists left in Turkey who would be open to the idea of a coup, even if they would not necessarily think it a good idea. But there's another thing too. Recently, quote unquote, relatively recently, there was a referendum as to whether the Turkish government should be a presidential system, should be changed to become a presidential system. That passed. But I think one of the reasons ultranationalists are not as worried about that as you might think, is because they think they could actually win a presidential election. Like, there was this woman in Turkey, and I don't remember her name. Maybe somebody in chat can conjure it. But there was an ultranationalist woman who voted. She was against the referendum. I believe that she was anyway. But she actually became pretty high profile, and she garnered a lot of support. And so, also, I might add that the referendum did not pass by a whole lot. Erdogan won, he got his way, but it only won by like 51 or something %, which is very narrow, which suggests that there are a lot of people in Turkey who might otherwise support the AKP, support the Erdogan, but who are suspicious about the degree of power he's accumulating. So it might be that there is a sufficiently large constituency in Turkey who would vote for someone besides Erdogan in a presidential election, specifically a nationalist candidate, that it may be that the presidential change to a presidential system may not be a defeat. So I think ultranationalists are kind of waiting and seeing how that plays out. Because if it's true that they could win a presidential election, that would preclude the need for a coup. So I think the military will wait around to see how the first presidential election goes before it starts planning anything serious. And even if Erdogan did win a presidential election, I think there would not be a coup unless he did something like really outrageous, like an explicit move to an authoritarian political system that was not just one party, but that was specifically centered on him as the center of power. If he did something like that, I think then the Turkish military would seriously consider intervening. But before that even happens, those two conditions have to be met. One, the presidential election would have to happen, and Erdogan would have to win, and then after winning, Erdogan would have to do something outrageous. I think those two conditions would have to be met before there would be a coup attempt. And again, I think a civil war in Turkey would probably be the result of a coup attempt, first and foremost. I don't think there are enough opposition people in Turkey who are radical enough, rabidly anti-Erdogan enough to start fighting, to start a civil war against the bulk of the population, which is still more or less pro-AKP, and who are suspicious of the traditional nationalist political parties. It's kind of a rural-urban divide. Erdogan's support is mostly rural, with some support from cities. And so those people are just naturally suspicious of city people. And, add in the traditional suppression of social conservative people, by the nationalist Ataturk, political party. I think it was the CHP over the course of the Cold War. That in conjunction with traditional urban-rural rivalry, that makes it pretty unlikely to me that there's going to be much outside the traditional urban core of voters who would support any attempt to start an uprising. And I don't think such an uprising would succeed, given that most of the population, a good chunk of the population is rural, and even in the cities, a good chunk supports Erdogan. So the numbers just don't add up, basically. I don't think the opposition is in a position to start a civil war and win. I think the only group in Turkey that could start a civil war and would want to would be the Turkish military. So that's my opinion. I don't live in Turkey. I'm not a Turkish expert. Maybe somebody knows better. I welcome any input. I want to learn too. So feel free to add in chat. But that's just my thought on Turkey and civil war. Can healthcare truly function and be fixed by the free market alone? If not, how much room is there for government to help out? E.g., how big should Medicaid be? Is socialized medicine an awful idea, etc.? So here's the thing, the word fixed in here. Healthcare truly function and be fixed. How you define be fixed varies according to your political ideology, basically. Like, people who are hardcore free marketeers will tell you, yeah, free markets can definitely fix healthcare. People who are very skeptical of free markets would say, no, definitely not. So this is kind of a subjective question. It kind of depends on your perspective. If you just want to lower premiums, then yeah, free market could fix that. If you're more concerned about giving healthcare to people who are poor and very sick, or even people who are middle class but are facing bankruptcy because of medical bills, if you're more interested in that side of the healthcare debate, the free market is probably not so much a viable solution. And I think the Republican Party here in the United States has kind of struggled to come up with a solution that really addresses that side of the problem. I think they've tried to focus more on the issues that face their constituents more, which is the rise in premiums. They've seemed to be more concerned about that rather than helping out the impoverished and sick. So I don't think there's a good free market solution to that. That almost inevitably will involve a fair amount of government involvement. But again, if by function and fixed you mean just in general, then yeah, free markets could make a free market healthcare system can quote unquote work and quote unquote function. It just depends on how you want to define work and function. Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of people, even before Obamacare, there were plenty of people who did just fine. If you had a middle class income an upper middle class income or an upper class income, if you were a top income earner, you did pretty well. If you can pay for it, you can get pretty good healthcare in the United States. But the debate was never about those people. The debate was always about the people who had trouble paying for healthcare, or did not have regular access to healthcare, or people who were bankrupted by their healthcare. That was more the issue. So if you're not as concerned by that side of the issue, if you think that, those people being partially excluded from the system or having access to lower quality healthcare is an acceptable price to pay for having a free market healthcare system and the benefits that confers, then yeah, a free market healthcare system is perfectly fine. And you didn't even necessarily need to change it much in the United States. I'm assuming we're talking mostly about the United States here and not just about healthcare systems in general. But a free market system, I don't think can really, if you are concerned about that lower working class, low income access to good healthcare, specifically good healthcare, I'm more skeptical about the free market's ability to address that. How big should Medicaid be? Is socialized medicine an awful idea? I mean, one thing you could do if you want government to help is just expand Medicaid to apply to those people. That could work hypothetically, but that would be a massive expansion in an entitlement program that the right would probably be very, very critical of. As far as socialized medicine, here's the thing about socialized medicine. You have to come up with a way to pay companies that provide health services and that provide pharmaceuticals. And in a lot of systems, it's really hard for those companies to get fair value because everybody has heard of a monopoly where you have one seller. Less well known is the monopsony, which is where you have one buyer. And in a lot of healthcare systems around the world, you have a monopsonic system where you have basically the state or maybe a few surrogates responsible for all of the healthcare insurance seekers in that market. And that gives them a lot of power, monopsonic power, to negotiate with insurance providers and pharmaceutical firms, rather. And so they end up having to make do with much less money than they would otherwise be able to get. Now, it's also true that some of those firms overcharge, and there is some profiteering there. But one of the big problems in the pharmaceutical industry, specifically the pharmaceutical industry, is that they're having a hard time making enough money to cover their costs. Because it's not as though every drug they research and develop ends up being marketable. Like some avenues of research end up at a dead end. And all of the money they put into researching that, they don't get any of that back. They have to make up for the cost from that by selling other drugs that are marketable, that do end up being marketable. And furthermore, also problematic is that the amount of time it takes to research and develop drugs is very long. So the amount of cost you're incurring over time ends up being relatively large, such that by the time the drug is marketable, you have to charge a lot in order to make that back, which is why pharmaceutical firms in the United States push so hard for intellectual property rights. They want very long terms wherein their intellectual property is protected, wherein they have a monopoly on the production of a given drug, because it takes a long time to sell the drug at a high price in order to make back all of the money that they lost, not only in the research and development of that drug, but on all the other drugs that they researched and developed that ended up being dead ends. And right now, there's no good answer to that problem, and the industry as a whole is really struggling with that. And the introduction of socialized medicine would put more pressure on them, not less, because that would probably mean they would end up getting lower prices because of the monopsonic power that would be wielded by the government or by government surrogates in negotiating for drug prices on behalf of people covered by the government plan. So that's not an innate problem, because you can, if you're a government, you can negotiate prices that do give them fair value. But then at that point, you expose yourself to political pressure, because then all of your voters will say, well, you could have negotiated a lower price. Why didn't you do that? Why are you screwing me out of cheaper drugs? And then if you argue, well, the industry needs money too, then there's a portion of the electorate that's going to be very critical of that. And then they'll accuse you of being in the pocket of, big pharma, being basically in the pocket of pharmaceutical lobbyists, which is not to say that there are no pharmaceutical lobbyists. There definitely are. But, at some point, you're going to face a question of whether or not you want to get elected or whether or not you want to give the industry its due. And most politicians will probably choose to be elected. So it's not really sustainable from a political perspective to give drug companies, quote unquote, fair value, whatever that is. That's an ambiguous term in and of itself. It's not really politically sustainable to give them that value. So over the long term, it probably would give way eventually, even if you went out of your way at first to try to give those companies fair value. So that's kind of the issue with socialized medicine. If you want socialized medicine to really work, you kind of have to go do what France did. France actually, the World Health Organization ranks France's healthcare system as the best in the world. And they don't use a national single-payer healthcare system like Britain or Canada does. They actually have a heavily managed system of insurance companies, wherein the government heavily subsidizes the industry and subsidizes individuals to pay for their insurance based on their income and based on their job. And I'm sure, the regulations must run into the thousands of pages. There's a lot there. But they went to the trouble of constructing that institutional apparatus to make that work, and apparently it works relatively well. So that would be a better idea. But the trouble with that system in the United States is that in America, we have this ethos where government involvement should be minimized. And so heavy regulation and a system of subsidies probably would not fly here, politically speaking. We tried to do that to a degree with Obamacare, and even that ended up being watered down to the point that it ended up being not sustainable over the long run. I mean, whether you're on the left or the right, Obamacare is not like, it's ugly. It's not ideal legislation. Everybody wants to change it, and it's not even really workable compromise legislation. The insurance industry, that's a whole nother conversation about the insurance industry and how it's getting squeezed and how it's basically collapsing as an industry under the pressure brought by the contradictions innate to the Obamacare legislation. But anyway, that's getting off on a tangent. Can a free market system work? Yes, it just depends on trade-offs. Every policy decision is a trade-off, and if you're willing to trade off some things, you can get others, but there's always that cost. It just depends on what your policy preferences are and what you're willing to give up. In that sense, a free market healthcare system can work. And how big Medicare should be, well, more accurately, how big government should be in helping out, that's also subjective. And it just depends on the political culture of the country in question. And, with regard to the United States, it just depends on your political preferences. How would the conflict in Syria be solved? You're not softballing the questions this time. How would the conflict in Syria be solved? Wow.
They've gone around and asked a lot of people, and they figured you're the only one who can really figure out this whole thing. It's a big clusterfuck, I know, but if there's anyone who can do it, it's Agent Smith.
I don't know about that, but all right, let me think about it for a minute.
Come on, Syria, get your shit together.
Yeah, there you go. There's a statement.
Well, we've unpacked a lot of the different moving pieces of why Syria is in a really shitty situation and the interests that led to the current establishment versus the bigger demographic in the region.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fundamentally, the problem in Syria is not really Syrian anymore. The Syrian conflict is a regional conflict. And it's specifically a conflict between the Saudis and Iran. The Syrian government was an Iranian ally. When the Arab Spring happened, there was a revolt in Syria, and the Saudis took that as an opportunity to undermine and attack an Iranian ally. And at first, it was pretty indigenous. It was mostly Syrians, but over time, most of the conflict has kind of been franchised, so to speak. The different players are basically proxies now of regional players. So the Iranian government has very little power in Syria now, even in areas that it technically controls. Most of the areas that are quote unquote pro-government are actually controlled by nominally pro-government warlords. So even if its own territory, Syria, the Syrian government doesn't have a lot of authority anymore. It's mostly just one actor among many that is being propped up by Iran, by their Iranian allies, basically. And then most of the rebel groups now are proxies of either the Saudis or the Turks. And the Turks are a big problem in Syria because, nominally, if it were just Iran versus the Saudis, you would have a kind of balance of power and they would reach a negotiated settlement of some kind, probably. But Turkey gives that side a lot more power than they would otherwise have. Because Turkey's right on the border, they have a lot of resources, they have a lot of intelligence assets on the ground, they have a capacity to intervene militarily directly that the Saudis don't really have. Like the Turks have several times intervened directly, sent their military into Syria on various pretexts. Generally, they were not large interventions, but their military is strong enough that they're not afraid that the Syrians would do something, or even that the Russians would do something in response. So the Turks basically give the rebels in Syria a lot more deterrent value than they would otherwise have, and that makes it harder to reach a negotiated settlement. Furthermore, the Qataris are basically on the same side as the Turks, and the Qataris has a shit ton of oil money. So with the Turks' manpower and diplomatic heft combined with the Qataris' money, that makes that side of the conflict pretty hard to dissuade from continuing the conflict. And that's especially problematic because the Turks and the Saudis are not really on the same side. They both support the rebel groups, but they have different ideas about, well, for one, they have different ideas about what the region should look like, about regional politics, but they also have different ideas about which groups to support. The Saudis, for example, and the Jordanians, who kind of work with them, are more reticent about supporting radical jihadi groups. They'll support some, but generally they only support the ones they have a lot of control over.
We only support the best groups.
Yeah. The Turks and the Qataris are a little more gung-ho. They're willing to accept more risk in terms of supporting groups that they have relatively less control over. And also, the Turks, broadly, regionally speaking, support the Muslim Brotherhood along with the Qataris. And so they're more interested in an outcome that involves some kind of Islamist political presence in Syria. Whereas the Saudis are much less interested in Islamism benefiting from the Syrian conflict. They're much more narrowly interested in hurting the Iranians and the Syrian government specifically. So the reason this divide between the Turks and the Saudis is a problem is that it makes it impossible for the rebels, being the proxies of these two groups, to have any kind of common understanding about what an eventual peace agreement would look like, or even to start negotiations on a peace agreement. So the first step in order to end this conflict in Syria is ending the conflict between the Saudis and the Turks, having them be on the same page. Once they reach an agreement on common goals and a commonly acceptable outcome to any potential peace agreement, then you could at least start negotiations with the Iranians and with the Syrians in order to reach some kind of peace accord. I'll note now, because I know somebody's going to bring it up, partition is not going to be a part of any peace agreement, because the rebels on the ground categorically reject any partition agreement. And actually the government is the same. Both sides of the Syrian conflict in Syria, this pro-Syrian force, pro-government forces rather, and the rebel groups, all of them reject partition as a solution because they all see themselves as Syrian and they want Syria to remain one whole country. And if the great powers negotiated a partition agreement and tried to implement it, everybody would just ignore it. And that's already happened. There was a peace accord, no, not a ceasefire, negotiated in Kazakhstan. And everybody was on board with that except the rebel groups and the government, and so nobody really observed it. The only parts of Syria that observed it were the parts of Syria that already had a ceasefire going, basically. So anything that the troops on the ground, basically the rebel groups and the government, rejects isn't going to happen, because they have no compunction with ignoring agreements by their nominal masters if it goes too far, so to speak. You know, proxies, the Saudis and the Iranians and the Russians have a certain amount of influence over their proxies in Syria, for sure. But anything that crosses certain red lines that will lead those proxies to ignore them. And that's actually also one of the big difficult things about solving the Syrian conflict. You know, reaching an agreement that's not only acceptable to the outside powers, but also to powers within Syria, to the different political groups themselves. So peace negotiations will be long and difficult on that count. But in order to even start that, you need the opposition to be all on the same page, and right now they're just not. So that would be the first step. Second step is reaching an agreement that would be acceptable to the Syrian groups actually doing the fighting. And then, maybe, you would have a peace accord that would sort of take place over the course of a couple years, ceasefire, start with a ceasefire, and then have a political component, and then eventually reintegrate Syria. So roughly, that's how the Syrian conflict could be solved. I don't know if it's how it will be solved, but that seems like the direction it's trending right now, and it seems like the best course of action since it involves rather less widespread killing, which ideally would not be a part of the peace process. So I'm sorry if that answer is not specific enough, or that's just roughly what I can think of off the top of my head as far as solving one of the world's more intractable conflicts. So before jumping into the next question, there was something I wanted to talk a little bit about, which was, it's actually got a couple of things, but I prioritized the questions over the current affairs stuff. But the Polish government was looking at passing a bill that would have given the judicial system in Poland, would have made the judicial system a lot more subject to political appointments by political parties, and it would have given the political party in power right now a disturbing level of influence over the judicial branch of Poland's political system. And it was looking like that was going to pass, and it was looking like there would be a showdown with the European Union, because the European Union threatened to suspend Poland's voting rights on the European Union Commission, if not also the Council of Ministers. I'm not sure about that, but basically their voting rights would have been suspended if they had passed this bill, which would have precipitated a crisis between Poland and the European Union. It's not as though tensions are great already. And then at the 11th hour, the president of Poland, who doesn't have a whole lot of power, because Poland's system is a parliamentary system, I believe, and presidents and parliamentary systems are not like presidents and presidential systems. They're basically, presidents in a parliamentary system have a veto power, and that's about it. Well, this guy exercised that power, which was a pretty bold move, since he's not like, again, presidents are not really powerful figures in their political systems. But this guy actually took a big risk and went out of his way and vetoed this legislation and headed off this major crisis that looked like it was brewing. So the party in power has said that they're going to continue trying to pass reforms to the judicial system, but it looks like they'll at least try to water it down a little bit. So this guy is kind of maybe not a hero, but he's certainly a historical figure now, because that whole trend was towards a major historical break with the European Union. Yeah, I think his name was some President Duda or some such. But that was a major event, and I thought it was worth mentioning.
Nice.
Okay. So anyway, the next question was, I noticed there's a lack of skilled workers in IT industries, medical field, etc. Most were taken by skilled immigrants due to lack of graduates in the field. Do you think the new generation of Americans don't have enough motivation to pursue these fields? This is a really interesting question. Because here's the thing, the IT industry, and this is something that's received criticism from both the right and left in the United States. So this isn't something that's really what I'm about to say isn't something that's really partisan. This is actually kind of a widely held criticism. The IT industry says that there's a shortage of workers, but at the same time, wages have not really risen, which is suspicious, because if there's a shortage of workers, there should be higher wages. And so there's a suspicion in the analytical community that actually there's not a shortage of workers and that the IT industry is purposely importing immigrant workers in order to suppress wages. Now again, this isn't something that's like a partisan, view. This isn't like a Trumpista type thing. This is something that's received criticism from analysts of both, leftist think tanks, rightist think tanks. This is kind of something that's received a lot of attention. So I don't think it's really true that there's a lack of workers per se being produced in the United States. It's partly a political issue. Now, I haven't studied it in depth, so I can't tell you the degree to which that's true. Certainly the United States does graduate a lot of people in these fields. I just couldn't tell you how much the lack of wage rises is due to immigrants or how much it's due to some other factor. And that would be an important question I would want to answer before committing on this particular issue. But as far as, do I think that the new generations don't have enough motivation to pursue these fields? No, I think there's still motivation. I think there's still a lot of people going into these fields. But I couldn't tell you why there's a lot of immigrants or why wages haven't risen. I haven't studied it enough to know that. But if you're interested in that topic, I would encourage you to look into that. And if you want to email me, I can, I'll probably read about it soon, because that's interesting. So if you want, you can email me about it and we can go into it there, once I've read more about it anyway. Is there a realistic chance that the EU bands together and severely curtails immigration from Muslim countries? Probably not, because and I don't actually think it's unlikely, because there's a lot of, internationalists who want more immigration, or because there would be like suppression of the people who want to limit immigration. I think it's unlikely just because I don't think countries would want to compromise on what they would consider a sovereignty issue. So in order to limit immigration from specifically Muslim countries, that would require the European Union as a whole to impose some kind of restriction on immigration from those countries. And I think a lot of countries would consider that an abridgment of their sovereign right to determine what specific countries they could take or would reject immigrants from. The European Union gets painted as this sort of monolithic entity that oppresses the countries that are a part of it. That's not really entirely accurate. I mean, the European Union is in some ways laughably decentralized and lacks substantive power. There's a lot of valid criticisms you can make of the European Union, but the degree to which it's an overbearing superpower, sort of new Soviet Union, I think that's a bit overblown. I don't really view it like that. But if there's a chance that individual European Union countries come together and on their own curtail immigration from Muslim countries, that's possible. But I think those countries probably would have done it by now if they were going to. I think it's much more likely that there will be a common agreement about what to do about the immigration crisis. And we've already seen some of that. Actually, one of the things I was going to bring up as far as current events was that Italy unilaterally has started sending its ships, its Coast Guard ships, into Libyan waters. And they say they've done that with the agreement of the Libyan government, but then the Libyan government said they hadn't heard anything from them, which means they are either lying, or it means that they negotiated with one of the other governments in Libya. Because there's one official UN-recognized government in Libya, but there's also another government in eastern Libya that's run by a general, and that I suspect is being propped up by the Egyptians in order to try to clamp down on Islamists, if not democracy in general, which is why I'm kind of suspicious of this guy's motives. His name is General Haftar, I think. But anyway, the Italians might have negotiated with him, and on his authority may have cited that as the legitimization for starting patrols in Libyan waters. And they've also started negotiating the opening of a immigration processing facility in Libya, as opposed to in the European Union. So I think those are promising trends, even if the Italians kind of did them without broader European support. But I think they could represent a model that the European Union as a whole could embrace. And even if the European Union doesn't embrace that model, I think eventually they'll come together and embrace something like that. And that's much more likely than the European Union banding together and curtailing immigration from Muslim countries. I think that would be I think that specific move would be a bridge too far. It's more likely there will just be an agreement focusing on immigration generally, and specifically with regard to immigration from Syria and sub-Saharan Africa, where most of the immigrants coming in are coming through. Basically, I think they'll focus more on stemming the current tide of immigrants rather than focusing on immigrants from Muslim countries specifically. Let's put it like that. That's kind of a meandering answer. What is the outcome that Russians would like in the Syrian conflict? Russians don't really care about Syria. It's not like a big deal to them. Like, Russia doesn't really have a horse in that race. You know, for the Russians, Syria was always about the Ukraine. You know, the Russians kind of got boxed in after their intervention in the Ukraine, and they needed leverage. You know, they needed diplomatic leverage that they could use to try to alleviate the sanctions pressure and some of the other consequences that came about as a result of that intervention. So Syria was a way to get some diplomatic capital they could use to bring pressure to bear on the United States and Europe in order to have some extra leverage in negotiations regarding the Ukraine and Crimea. For them, that's more important than anything that happens in Syria. Technically, they also have a naval base in Syria, so I guess preserving that, I don't know, they don't really use it that much, and it's not as though Russia has a lot of capacity to project force anyway. So I don't really know how important that naval base really is to Russian strategic considerations. And really, even if there were a new government, they'd probably still be able to keep it. I mean, they pay for that base as far as I know. So any new government that arose would probably be willing to let them keep the base in exchange for, you know, foreign currency. You know, a source of foreign currency, which is what it is for Syrians. So I think for them, more important is just the imagery. The fact that they were able to prop up an ally and keep them from collapsing. That's more important to them than anything else. At least outside of diplomatic leverage vis-a-vis the Ukraine. It kind of improves their position in the Middle East and their diplomatic capital with Middle Eastern regions, that they're seen as an ally willing to go to bat to really kind of intervene on the behalf of a beleaguered government. And so, so long as the Syrian government doesn't collapse entirely, and so long as specifically the Assad family continues to have a role in government, so long as that's the case, that probably is about as much as the Russians would hope for and would push for. Everything else is kind of just extra bullshit that they don't really care about. So that's about it for them. Just keeping the Assads in power and trying to look strong, improving their diplomatic position in order to improve their diplomatic position in the Middle East, and in order to generate diplomatic leverage for use in the Ukraine, for use regarding the Ukraine rather. And even just even the idea that they want to improve their diplomatic position in the Middle East, even that's of limited utility to them. There's not a lot they can do with that, since there's not, you know, Russians don't have a lot of credibility in the Middle East, even if they are seen as an ally that's willing to fight for a potential allied government. Russians aren't really well regarded in the Middle East. Part of that is enmity left over from Afghanistan, but you know, there's just also the fact that Russians are seen as very hostile to Islamists. And even though a lot of governments in the Middle East are not Islamist, that is sort of Islam, and socially conservative Islam is the dominant cultural zeitgeist and political zeitgeist in the Middle East, even if you're a nominally secular government. And the Russian government is seen as very hostile, not just to radical Islamists, but even just Islamism in general, which puts them at odds with a lot of countries. Keep in mind, Syria, the Syrian government is technically a secular nationalist government, but they're allied with the region's premier Islamist state, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so, the fact that Syria, Iran, and Russia are all fighting on the same side really speaks to the diplomatic realpolitik going on, and it speaks to the very nationalistic interests that are at play there with regard to Russia's intervention. So that's about it as far as what Russia wants out of the conflict. It's not really a whole lot. Is Brexit a good or bad move for the country, and why? I'm assuming by the country you mean Britain. Yeah, that's a very subjective question. Yeah, that just depends on your individual politics, because, if you're somebody who's very critical of the European Union and who's very big on sovereignty, then Brexit is a great move. That's not bad at all. On the other hand, if you like the European Union and you like being integrated into the regional economy, then not so good. That's obviously a big setback. I'll abstract away from the question, because I don't want to just say it's subjective and it depends. I'll abstract away and say Brexit was a really bad move, because it only passed by... the pro-Brexit people only won that referendum by 51%, and anytime a referendum only passes by 51% or a little over 50%, that's generally bad news for a country, because that means about half the country is dead set opposed to it and half the country is for it. And when you have that level of divide, it's almost impossible to get anything done. And that goes back to democratic norms, which we've talked about earlier, keep talking about. Generally, if you want to do something in a democratic society, you really want to generate a lot of political support for it. Because what happens when you do anything without substantive political support is that the people opposed to it sabotage it. So, Brexit is one, and you can already see that a lot of the anti-Brexit people are kind of doing what they can to sabotage it, and will probably continue to do more as time goes on. In turn, if the pro-Brexit people had lost that referendum, but only lost it by like 48%, if that had happened, then that also would have been bad, because then all of the pro-Brexit people would have continued to sabotage, basically, Britain's membership in the European Union and done everything they could to try to get Britain out. So, in that sense, Brexit is bad, because neither side built up substantial support amongst the voting electorate. And as a result, basically guaranteed political instability in Britain for the next, however, 3 or 4 years, over the course of which the Brexit negotiations are going to take place. It would have been much better, regardless of how the referendum vote went, if one side or the other had built up a lot of support, because then that would have severely limited the opposition's ability to sabotage whatever came after, whether that was Brexit or continued European Union membership. So in that way, I would say it's been bad. So there aren't any more questions, so I can tap some of these other current events things that I thought were interesting.
Go for it.
So in South Africa, there's been like an email leak. And it's turned into a huge scandal. And what was discovered was that the Zuma administration offered a cabinet position and money to members of a wealthy family in South Africa called the Guptas. The Gupta family is sort of these wealthy industrialists in South Africa. I think they're wealthy industrialists. They're wealthy anyway. And they're kind of tight with the Zuma administration in South Africa. And people have been accusing them of corrupt practices for a number of years now, but there hasn't really been a lot of hard proof. But this email leak kind of gave some substantive evidence to some wrongdoing there. And so that it turned into a huge scandal. But then it got worse, because then it was revealed that somebody, I think maybe the Guptas, maybe somebody in the Zuma administration hired a PR firm, a British PR firm, to try to take public attention away from the scandal and reduce the political pressure on the Zuma administration. And here's the kicker: the way that PR firm decided to do that was to release a bunch of media, basically launch a media campaign that was designed to increase racial strife in South Africa. And it's not as though South Africa is suffering from a lack of racial strife already.
See apartheid.
Yeah. So the fact that a PR firm would do that, and that their employer, whoever they were, the Guptas, the Zumas, whoever, was willing to do that for political reasons, made the scandal significantly bigger. That was considered, very, very offensive. And, again, that kind of goes back to democratic norms. We keep hitting on that. One of the democratic norms that a democratic society has to have and observe is that, you can't go out of your way to rankle the public. Like, you can't pander to people's prejudices and say things that are not politically constructive. Like, it's very politically destructive to just take groups and play on their fears and hatreds in a way that fires them up and makes them worse, but then doesn't lead to anything. Like, there's no purpose to this other than to make tensions greater. There's no greater agenda, there's no constructive conclusion. It's not part of some greater plan to improve the economy or improve politics. This is just a net loss for South Africa's political culture. So, in any democracy, pandering and, whipping up crowds, inciting crowds, as you might say, that's a norm that should not be broken. And when it is broken, that's generally bad news for any democracy. And this is an example of that. But it's also an example of ongoing tensions in South Africa. South African political culture has been roiled over the past few years by accused corruption in the Zuma administration. And it's actually been really interesting to watch because it kind of corresponds with the falling faith in the African National Congress, which at first had been the dominant political power in South Africa because it was sort of the party that ended apartheid. But then they slowly have discredited themselves over time through these corruption scandals. And you're seeing kind of the diversification of the South African political landscape as a result. The economic freedom fighters, as they call themselves in particular, are an interesting group. Because on the one hand, they're anti-corruption and they want more equitable economic outcomes, which you'd think would be a good thing. But on the other hand, they're somewhat antagonistic on racial issues, which is not so good. And it kind of remains to be seen how that plays out over the long term. You could see kind of more of a socialist economic management arise in terms of policy preferences, but at the same time see racial tensions actually worsen as tensions between whites who are more economically well off and the African community. The native black African community anyway. Whites in Africa actually consider themselves African, so you kind of have to specify black African. There could be more tensions between white Africans and black Africans as a result over the long term. So that's something to watch, basically. And I thought this was really interesting. South Africa's intelligence agency was found to have intervened in the 2012 election. Wait, I said South Africa, I'm sorry. South Korea. So this might be interesting to the stream in particular, since a lot of people on here seem to have a weird affinity for South Korea.
Yep.
So there was an election in 2012, and there was a suspicion that South Korea's intelligence agency was basically trying to sway public opinion through social media. It was launching a kind of almost Russia-style social media campaign to try to undermine basically the leftists in the campaign in favor of the conservative candidate, who incidentally was the woman who was recently impeached. And there's kind of long been a suspicion on the part of South Korea's left that the intelligence agency never really stopped being involved with politics after democratization. Obviously, before democratization, it was heavily involved in politics. But there was kind of an accusation, a suspicion that to a degree they were still involving themselves and trying to favor their preferred candidate. And kind of people in the middle had been willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. but now it's kind of come out that actually they were, that they also interfered in parliamentary elections in 2011 and 2012. Well, the 2012 election was the presidential election, but parliamentary elections, apparently they also interfered in those in 2011 and 2012. And, you know, even more controversial, they apparently placed some opposition politicians under surveillance, which is an especially bold move. So, as though the fallout from the impeachment proceedings is not enough to roil South Korea's politics, in addition to the North Korea crisis, there's also this new thing which casts into doubt the South Korean intelligence agency's impartiality. So then there was also this news from Pakistan, which I thought was pretty funny. The Prime Minister of Pakistan was a guy named Prime Minister Sharif, Nawaz Sharif, whom had been Prime Minister, I think, 2 times before, and he's never yet finished a term in office, because he keeps getting booted out for one reason or another. I think the second time he got kicked out because General Musharraf launched a coup back in 2000. So what got him this time was a corruption investigation stemming from the Panama Papers leak. You remember the Panama Papers, right? Well, it was a big release back in Panama. Panama is known for a place where you launder money, and there was a big release of papers and documents there, a big leak basically, and a shit ton of investigations resulted all over the world. And eventually some of Prime Minister Sharif's children got wrapped up in that. And the investigation got to a point where there was some property that they had not disclosed they had owned on some papers, some documents that basically they were supposed to disclose ownership of properties in this document, and they failed to disclose they owned this particular property. And apparently there's a waiver for that if you own property for long enough, or there's something like that. They basically needed to produce some proof that would have exonerated them. And so, lo and behold, that proof emerged. Well, what happened was some internet sleuths discovered that the font on that document had not been created when the document was supposedly written. And the implication was that the document had been forged, that they had written it such that it said that it was from such and such year, but actually it had been written like the month before. And so based on that font evidence, it was found to be basically a forged document, and then the case went ahead. And so because of that one mistake, Prime Minister Sharif was removed from power. You know, if not for that, he would still be there. So there was a joke in Pakistan's media, because it was probably one of his children. The suspicion is one of his children kind of did that. And so the joke in Pakistan was, you know, you had one job. You know, all you had to do was forge one document, and you couldn't do it.
What did we even hire you for?
Yeah, yeah. So another thing that happened was there was this issue about sanctions, additional sanctions on Russia. And Donald Trump was, of course, opposed to them. But Congress, in a rare bipartisan spirit, very much did want to extend sanctions, partly over the Ukraine, but partly as punishment over Russian interference, quote-unquote, in the American election in 2016. And so there was kind of a showdown then between Trump and Congress. And Congress pretty much ignored him. They were pretty adamant about passing these sanctions. And the hell of it is that Trump, there was so much support in Congress for the new sanctions that even if Trump had vetoed it, they had enough votes to actually override his veto. And this is an interesting, you know, development, because it kind of shows the Congress flexing its muscle. which you haven't really seen a whole lot of. You've seen the Congress kind of shut down presidents' agendas before. The Republicans did that with Obama, and the Democrats did that in the latter years of the Bush administration. But we haven't really seen examples of Congress actually implementing policy. Like up till now, it's mostly been Congress exercising its power to stop policy. But here's a rare example of the Congress actually implementing its own policy and overriding the executive branch. Yeah, Congress was actually designed to be the most powerful institution in the United States government, and it has all the potential to do it. You just haven't seen it much because Congress has been very deferential over the past few decades to presidents. And, if somebody wants to talk about that, we could talk about that because that's an interesting subject, the rise of the executive branch at the expense of the legislative branch. But yeah, here it's kind of coming back a bit. It's kind of exercising its power and flexing some muscle.
Aside from Bush, who were some of the other presidents who moved forward the power of the executive?
Who are some presidents who what?
Moved forward the power of the executive branch relative to the others and kind of caused Congress to be more deferential?
All of them. Pretty much all of them since the Cold War started. Pretty much all of them since, Roosevelt really, going all the way back to the 1930s, he was one of the first guys to really push federal power, government power. But Congress had always acted as a pretty strong check against Roosevelt and Truman, and to a lesser degree against Eisenhower and the Cold War presidents. Congress really took Nixon to task. Like, the Nixon administration got mangled by Congress, especially in its later years. But starting with around 1980, starting kind of with the late Carter administration or the early Reagan administration, you kind of saw the rise of what came to be known as the Leviathan, the imperial presidency. And what started at that point was not so much presidents going out of their way to accumulate power. It was more Congress kind of giving away power. Where Congress before would have had input or would have tried to assert control, they started just kind of giving the president what he wanted. And that started slow. It wasn't like a big trend in the 80s, but it started to happen in the 80s. And then it kind of took off in the 90s, and it has really just taken off ever since. Congress will generally defer to the president in terms of policy direction regarding foreign policy and certain other policy areas. And part of the reason for that is congressmen like to defer blame. Like, if congressmen do something actively, then if it goes wrong, they get blamed. But on the other hand, if they just pass the president's policy, well, that's the president's fault. That's not my fault. You blame the president for that. I was just following orders. So part of it is congressional cowardice.
Accountability is a very scary thing.
Yeah, very, very much so, especially if you're a federal politician. But also some of it is partisanship. Because of the partisan environment, you're seen as there's an obligation almost to work with your side. And so if your guy is in power, right, if your guy controls Congress or controls the presidency, then you're supposed to work with him. You're not supposed to rock the boat. And so as a result, there's not as much policy debate within political parties, within the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. It was just expected that you would push the party's sort of accepted policy preferences without question. And that's become more and more of a norm over time, unfortunately. We're starting to see that change a bit, because the Republican Party over the past 10 years has basically been in a state of civil war between people who are kind of more populist and the people who are more traditional economic conservatives. And then we're starting to see the same thing in the Democratic Party, where there's a similar schism between populists and establishment voters. And I'll emphasize here that it's not just populist versus establishment politicians. There are a lot of people who vote for those establishment politicians and who like establishment policy preferences. So it's more a battle between those voters and the populist voters, not so much between populist voters and the quote-unquote system, so to speak. But yeah, that's where it stemmed from. It's more Congress giving up power than it is the presidency taking power. So that's the short answer to that.
Right. So they can shift responsibility and basically play a lower risk game.
Yeah.
And it's an
Well, that's
interesting
it.
concept that it's not the income security is a little bit strange if you're working in politics, because if you get elected, sure, you get the money of when you're in office and doing all that, but what about when it's near the end of your term? You want to defend your seat, basically. That's the most important thing, and then maybe second most important is your constituency, maybe,
Yeah.
if you're a good politician.
Yeah. I mean, and part of that plays into the gerrymandering issue,
Hmm.
because then then you especially have an incentive to follow the party line, because then you're getting voted in by party people.
よろしく。忙しくなりそうですね。
So we had a few more questions come in. What are your thoughts on the Virginia Oh wait. Yeah, what are your thoughts on the Virginia protest fight? It's an example of political violence, and I'm not that concerned by it. I mean, obviously it sucks. I don't approve of it, but political violence happens even in developed countries, even in very mature democracies, like in Europe or the North America. So it's going to happen every so often, one way or the other. This one was a little unusual in the size of the white nationalist presence, obviously, but that's just a reflection of overarching politics. That'll die down if the populist waves dive down, and if the populist wave doesn't die down, then you can expect more of that, probably. Hopefully not as violent.
Well, and if we look at the history, the Deep South has had that type of attitude for a long time. It's not really a new thing. It's kind of like that current in society has gotten a lot louder with the Trump administration.
Exactly. It was already there. You're just seeing a little more of it. Political violence in the United States right now is not at anything resembling the level it was in the 1960s. As partisan as things are now, major leaders are not being assassinated. There are no major citywide protests that just disintegrate into riots. Cities aren't burning because of, riots. It's nowhere near that level. So this is, obviously the trend is negative. You don't want to see more violent incidents like that. And there does seem to be growing tension there does seem to be growing incidents of violent interactions between protest groups. But the overall political environment is not as bad as it was in the 60s, and until it is, I'm not impressed, basically. This is a manageable level of political violence right now. And again, I don't approve of it. Ideally, there would be no political violence. That goes back to political norms, democratic norms. In a democracy, if you reduce your discourse to violence, then every incidence of discourse will be violent. There will be no way for you to have a civil conversation if civil conversation in which views are exchanged, in which negotiations are had and compromises made, if the only way that you can interact with the other political group is violently. So I'm very much opposed to the establishment and any trend that would lend itself to the establishment of violent political interactions as a norm of democratic politics. That obviously would be a net loss for any political culture, not just the United States.
Yeah, a lot of us don't really have the sense of what the civil rights movement looked like, and something like Martin Luther King Jr. being assassinated. We don't really have a similar example of someone who's pushing for something politically and them just getting straight up shot dead. Or Martin Luther King, sorry, not Martin Luther King, Kennedy being shot too.
Yeah, Kennedy, Kennedy's brother, RFK, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and that's not counting all of the attempted assassinations.
Yeah.
There's a whole litany of those as well, so we're not nearly at that level. Not nearly so. So that's a good thing, and hopefully that that remains the case. So I'm noticing a pattern today. There are no easy questions. Should states be allowed to display the Confederate flag on government property?
Yeah, Pac was saying in the chat that that's a more of a social question, which doesn't really play into your expertise.
Well, more to the point, it's a subjective question, and I think I'll couch my answer in those terms. Whether or not the Confederate flag should be displayed or should be allowed to be displayed on government property, I think should be a decision taken by localities. Obviously, at a state level, the state as a whole has a role to play. But in the case of localities, which is mostly where the tension is happening, because a lot of these statues that are being removed, which was the instigation, by the way, for the Charlottesville protest, there's a number of monuments and statues of Confederate leaders from the American Civil War that are being removed, and that's led to a lot of protests on the part of the right-wing conservatives who are opposed to the removal of those statues. A lot of those statues were put in place at the local level. And so, kind of going beyond the ambit of the question, beyond just the Confederate flag, Confederate symbols in general, whether they are displayed on government property, I think should be the decision of individual local localities, local government. Because I think you're much more likely to reach a consensus that people find acceptable at the local level. And that's kind of general, that's another democratic norm. Generally, you want to give localities more political power just for that reason, just because there's generally more political homogeneity, and you're more likely to have broad agreement about what should be done and fewer rabid disagreement about what should not be done at the local level. And again, it's a subjective question. People can disagree with that, but I think localities should just be given that right, in my opinion. Of course, there's the question about, is the display of the Confederate flag innately racist? What is the symbolism? That's a whole nother discussion. Focusing narrowly on, whether it should be allowed to be displayed, I think that's something for individuals to decide for themselves, and that individual communities should be allowed to decide for themselves.
It's interesting, too, if you're considering the distance from when the Confederate flag was used for factions that actually operated versus where we are now in 2017, that we're approaching 2 centuries.
Yeah.
2 full centuries back, where there's no living person who served in the Confederate Armed Forces who is still, somewhere in Arkansas.
Yeah. Well, Confederate symbolism goes way beyond just the Civil War or the Confederacy. It has a very strong sort of association with autonomy. One of the somewhat fake excuses that was propagated by the South for the Civil War was, it's about states' rights. It's about our right to live, to run our states the way we want. In other words, have slavery. That's kind of an obfuscation of the real reasons for the American Civil War. We could talk about the American Civil War sometime. That would be fun. Mm-hmm. But specifically with this topic, Southerners viewed the Civil War as an exertion of their autonomous right to live the way they wanted to. Again, that's debatable. But I think it's notable that Confederate symbolism became significant again after the Civil War, mostly in the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 1960s. Up until that point, Confederate symbolism was definitely still around, but it really was brought back. And the reason was that a lot of Southerners felt put upon by the federal government's attempt to force them to integrate as part of the Civil Rights Movement, because most white people in the South were very opposed to that. And the fact that other parts of the country, specifically the federal government, was forcing it was seen as almost a repeat of the Civil War, where a federal government was seen as trying to force them to get rid of slavery. Now, obviously, getting rid of slavery, the Civil Rights Movement, these things are good, pretty much. For the most part, objectively good. I would go so far as to say that. But for a lot of people at the time, it felt very much like their views were being discounted, and that the government was forcing it on them almost maybe not unconstitutionally, but against the spirit of the Constitution. You know, against democratic norms. Basically, they kind of saw it as a violation of democratic norms for the central government to force a region of the country that traditionally had been left on its own to change against its will, more to the point. And so Confederate symbolism as a symbol of autonomy then was brought back because it was seen as kind of a symbol of resistance against federal authority.
Yeah.
And ever since then, it's kind of been associated with the South and Southern independence. And, you know, again, it's also a symbol of racism. The two are not really mutually exclusive because, you know, on the one hand, yeah, the South has a lot of history that doesn't have to do with racism and slavery and whatnot, but a lot of the exertions of Southern independence and autonomy have related somehow to race and African Americans over the course of American history. Not every case, but a lot of them. So the two are inextricably linked. But people, I mean, in the same way, because that's the case, because the two are linked, because Southern heritage is linked with racism and institutional racism, people who say that Confederate symbolism is not about hate, but rather more about heritage, those people are not wrong. But it's also not entirely wrong to say that it's a race. It's not wrong to say it's a racist symbol either. And I don't want to send the message that all people who want to display Confederate symbolism are just innately racist, because there is Southern heritage that people want to celebrate without being racist. Those people exist too. They don't get as much media attention. But it's just very hard to parse the symbolism because it does encompass both racism and non-racist symbolism. And for those people who do want to embrace their heritage without being racist, the symbolism poses a deep challenge. Because obviously, if you're African American in the South, it's explicitly racist. You know, that's not your heritage.
Yeah.
You know, when people use Confederate symbolism to talk about their heritage, what they're really talking about is white heritage. And that's, well, for one, it's exclusive. That's a very particular heritage. But at the same time, I don't think it really serves any greater purpose to try to push that symbolism out of the public sphere. Because while yes, that is a form of racism, those people see that as an attack on their heritage. And it's very hard to reconcile African Americans who believe it's a racist symbol and white Southerners who want to embrace it as a symbol of heritage. If you're going to take the view that this should always be displayed, or if you take the view that symbolism should never be displayed. And that's why I say it should be decided at the local level. You know, at the local level, you're probably going to have mostly white communities who would probably mostly agree that it's fine, or you would have a mostly black community that says no, or you would have a mixed community where people would have a compromise. But if you just have, like, at the state level, you know, if the state just says, no, get rid of all of these monuments or some such, that would be seen as, you know, again, that's just another form of a greater authority forcing people to change. And that's what really triggers these people. You know, what triggers white Southerners, so to speak, is exertions of authority that try to force them to change. You know, one of the reasons the civil rights movement was so successful was that the principal form of proselytizing came in the form of people traveling to the South and interacting with people at a local level. Like Martin Luther King was able to convert a lot more white Southerners by talking about how white Southerners had a lot more common with black Southerners than they did with rich white Southerners. That was much more successful than anything the federal government ever did. You know, the federal government can address institutional racism, but it can't really address local racism. Like, to do that, you really have to get in on the ground floor. Like a Christian missionary, right? You have to get in, live among the people, and proselytize. You have to speak to them in a language they understand and try to understand them in order to construct an argument that's compelling to them. And that's not an easy thing to do. That's like a long-term job. That's generational work.
That sounds like counterinsurgency kind of thing, where you have to live there and stay there for a long period of time and try and change things rather than just move a few key people and then expect the norms to change. Because it's about the norms really evolving over time.
That's exactly what it is. And it's also better than the top-down hierarchical approach because it avoids them starting an insurgency, right? Because the harder the government cracks down on racism, the more underground it goes, and the harder it is to track. right? If it's out in the open, then you can say, okay, I can measure it, I can see its scope, I can see how it's impacting people. But if the racism becomes secret, if everybody hides their racism, it becomes much more difficult to see where it is and how it's affecting people. And at that point, if you want to fight racism, then the measures you take have to become ever more paranoid, right? You start linking ever more minute aspects of behavior with racism in order to identify it and fight it. And that makes it harder for people in the political middle to identify with the fight against racism and to take part in it, because they see increasingly overbearing measures being taken in the name of anti-racism. So in that sense, proselytizing at the local level is more effective, you know, to my mind anyway. Again, this is all my opinion. I'm not trying to preach. Well, I guess a little bit, but I guess a little bit. But yeah, this is my opinion on it. So local level, let the localities decide, and then proselytizing at the local level would be more effective than just blanket banning symbols. You know, I thought actually I saw a video on Al Jazeera a couple weeks ago that I thought they were interviewing a guy in one of these towns where they were removing statues, and I thought he had an interesting insight. And he said that the problem wasn't so much the statues. He was a white guy, by the way, full disclosure. But he said the problem was not so much the statues. The problem is that there's a lack of representation of African Americans. Like, there's all these statues of Confederate leaders. Where are the statues of African American leaders? Like, there's none, right? Mm-hmm. So this guy's idea, this was his offer. His thought was, you know, don't tear down these Confederate statues, because again, there's lots of white Southerners who see that as an attack on them. Instead, put up statues of other people. You know, put up statues that would represent the diversity of the community at the local level. And he saw that as a compromise. And, you know, make of that what you will, but that seems like a better mode of thinking. Some compromise in that vein. Maybe not that compromise exactly, but that type of thinking, I think, is more productive than the more confrontational binary thinking. You know, which sees it as, do we get rid of the Confederate symbols or do we keep them? It doesn't have to be binary like that. There are more nuanced ways you can approach it. And I would prefer an approach like that. I would see an approach like that as being more successful.
I noticed quite a bit of that type of representation when I lived in Atlanta at the Team House, because the population there, I think it's pretty close to 50-50 between whites and blacks, which is way higher than Texas. Texas is very, very white by comparison. And just walking through the Atlanta airport, there's a lot of plaques and little historical pieces on a lot of the key black leaders in Georgia and Atlanta over the course of the last few centuries. And I thought that was really cool. And that's kind of the point that you're talking about, of telling their story as well. So it's more inclusive.
Yeah, Atlanta is a really encouraging example, because in Atlanta there's a very large African-American middle class, and they're actually doing relatively well. Doesn't mean they don't have problems, but it is encouraging to see an example somewhere of a flourishing African-American community that you can point to as a counterexample to the failing ghetto communities. Because whenever people in the United States talk about the African-American community, it almost invariably focuses on ghettos. Which is not a fair representation of the African-American community. Most African-Americans don't live in these violent ghettos. Most of them live in, you know, Atlanta or in rural South or in other places like that. So that, you know, it's not representative. That's not to say that those ghettos don't deserve attention and that they're not representative of the unique problem that doesn't have to do with, you know, various forms of institutional racism or what have you. But I don't think it really does the African-American community any service to focus on those communities disproportionately. I think one of the reasons African-American community in the United States is perceived so poorly by so many whites is because so much of the portrayal of African-Americans is on those communities. So that's the question about the Confederate flag.
Yeah. A bit of a meandering answer to a meandering question, like we do.
Yeah. So I'm sorry if that doesn't quite satisfy the questioner. That's what I've got off the top of my head. If you want more, feel free to email me. I'm happy to talk about these subjects in further depth if anybody wants to. The next question. can nationalism be used as an effective tool to curtail Islamism in the Middle East? It depends on how you define Islamism. If you mean like radical Islamism, then hypothetically yes. The trouble with that is that there's already been a big nationalist movement in the Middle East that was pan-Arab nationalism, and it's kind of seen as a failure now, because a lot of pan-Arab nationalist governments have just ended up being corrupt and authoritarian and very ineffective, with poor governance and poor economic management that leaves people with few opportunities. So nationalism kind of had its chance and failed. Could it be brought back in some way? To a degree. But it probably wouldn't be like Arab nationalism. It would probably have to be something focused more on individual states. But the trouble with more nation-based, or rather a more state-based nationalism, is that a lot of states in the Middle East do not have credibility. Like, a lot of them are very arbitrary, artificial creations, usually by Westerners after World War I. So like Jordan and Saudi Arabia and these kinds of places that kind of are more the progenitors of some of this radical Islamist violence. You know, those places would have a hard time generating nationalism. Maybe Saudi Arabia could have a better time, because Saudi Arabia is basically just Arabia. But something more artificial like Syria or Jordan, nationalism is probably more difficult in a place like that. Now, on the other hand, if by Islamism you just mean political Islam, just Islamism as a political manifestation, then definitely not. Because Islamism is part and parcel of the national identity of everybody in the Middle East. Islam plays a big role in everybody's life there. And being such a conservative society, Islam is always going to be involved in politics somehow. You know, even if you're kind of on the left, you know, being on the left of the Middle East politics probably means you still would involve Islam in your politics to some degree. And, you know, that's no great sin. Europe used to be the same way with Christianity. You know, it's just economic and social development has not taken as much place in the Middle East as it has in other places. And so they're still at a stage where religion is still an important part of politics. And, you know, make of that what you will. That's what you make of that depends on your politics. But it's not as much of a problem as you might think. It's not like a big reason behind all of the radical Islamist violence. That's just a natural part of any country's or region's political development. I'm tempted to try to think of, if not nationalism, then what would be an effective tool to curtail Islamism in the Middle East? Because I'm assuming this person is asking this not just to ask about nationalism, but what can be done to curtail Islamism in the Middle East. I mean, the shortest and best answer really is just good governance. Just because good governance would build the legitimacy of states, it would improve economic opportunities for people, and it would give a valve to release all of these pressures that are building up in these societies, owing to growing populations and limited economic opportunities. So good governance easily would be the big thing that could be done. Above and beyond any political, you know, above and beyond any ism, like nationalism or communism or liberalism, good governance, whatever the government, would alleviate a lot of that pressure. Do you think the U.S. government should cut the public spending in order to reduce the national debt? There are a lot of different ways to reduce national debt. Cutting government spending is one of them. But at the same time, you would have to leave taxes the same. And the impetus right now in the American political culture is very much on lowering taxes. So lowering taxes might generate more tax revenue over the long term, depending. You know, there's a whole analytical debate about that. But you know, if you're going to lower taxes, then you've got to lower spending. Otherwise, you're actually growing the deficit. So cutting spending, which again would help, would have to be matched with either stagnant taxes or an increase in taxes in order to reduce the national debt. On the other hand, you could plan over the long term, which is what most people in Washington do. They generally don't talk about it that much in media, because once you get into the meat of the policy-making process, it stops being sexy. And if you're a politician, you want some sexy media bite that you can just throw out, you know, some sound bite. And actual policy negotiations rarely are conducive to that. Basically, what you can do is you can just look at spending over the course of 10 years rather than over the course of a given year. And you can fix a budget in place, right? Fix taxes rather in place. Or more accurately, fix spending in place. That's what I should say. I apologize. Fix spending in place. And then you can either increase or hold taxes where they are, and then revenue will increase over time as the economy increases. And then because spending is fixed, you can just take all of that extra revenue that grows over time because spending was fixed in place and put all of that towards the deficit. You wouldn't have to lower or raise taxes to do that. That's just purely a freeze in spending. And so, no, there are a lot of little things you can do like that at a budget level for individual departments that could be conducive to that. But I guess that's kind of going off on a tangent. Should government spending be reduced to cut spending? Basically, that's just a subjective question. That just depends on your politics. The question implies that I mean, just the way the question is worded. Maybe the questioner didn't mean it like this, but the way the question is worded implies that that's the only way to do it. It's not. So if you're conservative, you probably think that's totally viable and that should be done. That's fine. If you're a leftist, you would probably be opposed to that. You would probably want some other method to do it. So it's all just a function of your politics, basically.
Sweet. Well, I think we're right around 8 hours for today's stream. 7 hours 58. We do have a couple more minutes, so if there was anything else you wanted to address or tie up or wrap up or all that, we could do that.
I did have some corrections for some stuff we talked about last week, but it's going to take more than 5 minutes, so I'll take a pass. I'll save it for next week.
Cool. Well, it's good to be back in the saddle doing these. It's one of my favorite parts of the streaming week, getting all that knowledge. Anyone who missed parts of this or most of it, the VOD will be on YouTube probably within a couple hours. I usually highlight it and then upload it pretty quick. But yeah, thanks everyone for hanging out, asking questions, and supporting the stream and Agent Smith. And we'll be back doing this next Sunday evening. And also thanks to Packed Facts for organizing the handing off of questions and
oh yeah,
and all that. Give thanks. Well, cool. See you, dude. Keep it real.
Yep, you too. Thanks again.
Mm-hmm.